Chapter 41. After Devlin left, Hero hired the little mare again from Martin McBroom's stables and rode out to Northcote's home farm for her appointment with Samuel Atwater. She found the steward supervising the storing of a load of newly harvested grain in the ricks. "Devlin tells me you're a critic of the enclosure movement," she said, after her groom had taken the horse off, and they turned to walk up the lane. "That surprises you," said Atwater. She found herself smiling. "Actually, it does. I would think that as a steward you'd be the first to criticize the ancient open field system." The laugh lines beside his eyes deepened as he squinted into the distance. "Perhaps I'm simply getting old. I liked England the way it was when I was a lad, but we'll never see those days again, will we? And it isn't only the look of the land that's changed, I'm afraid. The people have changed too. Time was, Englishmen were part of a community. They had a stake in the land they worked, but not anymore. The enclosures have changed our entire sense of who and what we are." "You must admit the old ways were wasteful," said Hero. "You mean the 3-course rotation system? Oh, aye. But that wasn't the fault of the open field system. 4-course rotation can work in an open field as easily as on a rich man's enclosed estate. Yet surely it's easier to get one man to change his ways than to get 50 to agree to it. Not if those 50 are educated. But then that's the last thing those pushing for enclosure want now, isn't it? Education makes men dangerous." It was a remarkably radical thing to say, and Hero found herself wondering if Samuel Atwater, like Alex Dalrymple, had been a member of one of the corresponding societies that sprang up across England in the first days of the French Revolution. "Those are the arguments used to justify enclosures," he was saying, "but they make about as much sense as the argument that access to commons makes men too lazy to work for wages." He gave a rough laugh. "I wonder how willing the likes of Malthus and Burke would be to spend 16 hours working in a factory for $1 a day." "Or down in a mine," said Hero. He threw her a quick, penetrating glance. "You've read Adam Smith?" "I have, yes." "Smith claimed the best way to help the poor is by making the rich richer. And we've seen how well that's worked now, haven't we? I suppose that's why the population of America is swelling with all the families we've pushed off the land here. Those who lived long enough to make it there, at any rate." Hero watched the sun slip behind the oak trees lining the lane, leaving them in shadow. She said, "I've seen what's left of the hamlet of Maplethorpe. It's very sad." "You should have seen it back in '95 when wages were falling as fast as prices were rising, and folk took to wearing shirts made of sackcloth and eating acorns. A lot of the little ones died. The little ones and the old." He took a breath that lifted his chest. "The thing is, you drive the cottagers and small farmers off the land, and most everyone else suffers too, don't they? How are the millers and thatchers, the carpenters and shoemakers to feed their families if there's no work for them? Only ones don't suffer are the rich men in their big houses." "Yet George Irving is dead, and his big house of ruin." "Aye, that's true enough." "I'm told you had a run-in some years ago with a group of men in blackface." "I did, yes, but they did me no harm. You'll find no man-traps or spring guns on Northcote. Not while I'm steward here, at any rate. It's a sorry state of affairs when a rich man's deer, hare and pheasant are allowed to eat a poor man's crops, and there's nothing he can do about it without hanging." "Was Irving behind the hangings and transportations that took place in the parish 20 years ago?" "Of course he was. He couldn't catch the protesters at what they were doing, so he hired someone to make things up. And it worked, didn't it?" "Do you believe the fire that killed him was an accident?" Atwater glanced up at the dark shapes of swifts darting across the sky above.
"You've heard about the Earl over in Oxfordshire, who evicted all his cottagers and levelled their villages so he could expand his park, only to go hunting one day and fall down the abandoned well of one of the cottages he'd levelled? His greed killed him, didn't it? It doesn't happen often, But every once in a while, people do get what they deserve in this life."
He drew up then and turned to face her.
"Never tell me you're thinking there's some connection between the events of 15 and 20 years ago and what's happening now."
Devlin thinks it a possibility, yes. He frowned.
"You've read Goldsmith's poem, The Deserted Village?"
Yes. Atwater nodded.
"It's good you're writing this article. Someone needs to explain what the enclosures are doing. Someone besides the poets. 100 years from now, their words will be dismissed as romantic sentimentalism, if they're read at all."
Hero studied the steward's plain, earnest face, and knew a whisper of disquiet. "We still read Shakespeare?"
"We do. So we do,"
he said quickly, clearing his throat in a way that made her wonder if his thoughts had paralleled hers.
"And now, you must excuse me. I see another wagon coming in from the fields. Shall I send a man for your groom?"
Later, when the sun was high in the sky, Hero walked up the lane to the ruined medieval tower that overlooked Ayleswick and its surrounding countryside. She was sitting with her back to one of the crumbling walls, her gaze on the ghostly traces of the lost furrows and ridges of the past, when she noticed Sebastian climbing the hill toward her.
"It's an impressive view,"
he said, coming to sit beside her.
She shifted to lean gently against him.
"I keep thinking that if I stare at it long and hard enough, everything will make sense."
"Is it helping?"
"No," she said with a laugh. "I had an interesting interview with Samuel Atwater this morning. He's very radical."
"He is indeed."
"You think that might be significant?"
"I think it could be."
He told her then of his conversation with Liv Weston and Jude Lowe. When he had finished, she said, "Is it possible Leopold Seton was Emma's father?"
"I'm beginning to think he was, but we may never know for certain."
She was silent a moment, her gaze on the rain clouds bunching over the Welsh mountains to the west. "While you were gone, I borrowed the Reverend Underwood's copy of Debrett's Peerage, along with a weighty history of Scotland and another of Wales." He turned his head to look at her.
"And?"
"Guinevere Stuart did marry a Scottish laird, Malcolm Gordon. In addition to her 7 ill-fated sons, she had a daughter she named Adiana, after her mother."
"So that part of the tale is true?"
"It is. Adiana married a Welsh nobleman, the Earl of Penllyn, and had 2 daughters and 4 sons."
"And it was one of those daughters who married a Lord Seton?"
Hero nodded. "Isabella. It was with Isabella Seton that Guinevere first took refuge after her husband divorced her. But the Lord Seton of the time wasn't comfortable with her presence, so Guinevere lived the last years of her life in Wales with her daughter Adiana." Hero hesitated, and after a moment Devlin said,
"There's something else. What is it?"
She met his strange yellow gaze and held it. "It's about Guinevere's daughter, Adiana, the one who married the Earl of Penllyn."
"Yes?"
3 of her 4 sons joined the Jacobite cause along with her 7 brothers, and were all killed. But the eldest son, Edwin, publicly repudiated his brothers and became, in time, the next Earl of Penllyn. By all accounts, he was a rather unpleasant fellow, and eventually died without a son of his own. But he did have 1 daughter, Catherine, born late in his life. Catherine married unwisely, probably out of desperation to get away from her father." Devlin kept his gaze on her face, and she wondered what he saw there.
"Hero, what are you trying to tell me?"
She sucked in a deep breath that did nothing to ease the strange pressure in her chest. "Catherine married the Earl of Atherstone and died giving birth to a daughter, also named Guinevere." Devlin stood up abruptly and went to stare out over the valley below.
"I take it this daughter is the same Guinevere who married the Marquis of Anglesey several years ago?"
"Yes." It was through Guinevere Anglesey that Devlin had recovered his mother's necklace when it was found clasped around the beautiful young woman's dead body. It was a long moment before he spoke. his voice scratchy with the intensity of his emotions. "Someone told me once that Catherine Atherston's great-grandmother was burned as a witch. But that can't be true if her great-grandmother was Guinevere Stuart." Hero went to stand beside him. "No. Guinevere Stuart lived to be 102, but such tales are often corrupted and twisted as they're passed down through the generations. It could have been some earlier ancestor." "Perhaps. Yet none of this explains why my mother was given the necklace." "No." They watched as a tall, slender young woman with a basket over one arm left the cottage near the millstream and turned toward the village. After a moment, Sebastian said, "I sometimes wonder if the problem is that I keep trying to find connections where none actually exist, between my mother and the necklace, and the women who once possessed it, and between the dark past of this village and these recent murders." "There is a connection," said Hero, slipping her hand into his. "In both cases, we simply haven't discovered it yet." Chapter 42. Some 20 minutes later, Sebastian was waiting outside the village shop while Jenny Dalrymple exchanged the 2 pounds of butter she'd made for a length of candle wicking and other supplies. She packed her purchases in her basket, then cast him a decidedly hostile look as she left the shop and turned toward home. "What do you want with me?" she asked as he fell into step beside her. "I want to know how Alex Dalrymple came to be accused of working with the French." She kept walking, her gaze on the road ahead. "What difference does it make to you?" "It does. Isn't that enough?" For a long moment he didn't think she meant to answer him. Then she said, "You ever hear of Colonel Edward Despard?" Sebastian suspected there were few in England who hadn't heard of Colonel Despard. An army officer who had served with distinction from Jamaica and the American colonies to Honduras, Despard was accused by a government informant of plotting to seize control of the Bank of England and kill King George III. It was true that Despard had become a vocal member of one of the many corresponding societies that sprang up across Britain in the years after 1789. But the corresponding societies were legal in those days, and the evidence for the outlandish charges against him was laughably weak. That didn't stop the Attorney General, Spencer Perceval, from putting him on trial, along with 6 co-conspirators. Admiral Nelson himself testified in Despard's behalf, but all 7 were nevertheless convicted of high treason and sentenced to be hanged, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. At the last minute, fear of a public revolt caused the government to abandon the medieval ritual of torture and dismemberment they'd planned, and Despard was simply hanged and beheaded. But Sebastian had never believed the colonel guilty of anything more than admiration for the principles espoused by Thomas Paine and the American and French revolutions. That, and marrying a beautiful young black woman descended from slaves. He said, "I'm told your husband was a member of the local corresponding society." "He was, but so was lots of others back then." She stared off down the winding road, the features of her face held tight. Alex dreamt of a day when every Englishman, rich or poor, would have the right to vote and run for Parliament, when every child could learn to read and write, and a man couldn't be thrown in prison for the crime of speaking his mind. But that doesn't mean he didn't love his country. It was because he loved England so much that he wanted it made better for everyone, not just for the likes of George Irvine or Lord Seaton. Who accused him? A nasty little weasel named Wat Jones. We learned later he was paid to do exactly what he did, worm his way into the local corresponding society so he could then denounce all his friends to the authorities with a pack of lies. Who paid him? George Irving? I always thought so. But it could even have been the high and mighty Earl of Powys himself, for all I know. Alex stirred up the whole county with his ideas. That's why they knew they had to find a way to kill him. How old was he? 22. They'd reached the cottage, and she drew up to turn and face him. Alex has been dead 20 years, and nothing he dreamt of seeing has ever come to pass. The hamlet of Maplethorpe is little more than a memory, and now Jamie's dead too." "It will come to pass some day," said Sebastian. "The things he fought for. They will." She gave a sharp, disbelieving laugh, but there was a fragility, a bleakness about her that touched his heart. "So saith his lordship, son and heir to the great Earl of Hendon." Rather than answer her, Sebastian said, "Jamie told me once that his father was either an English lord, a Welsh cavalryman, or a simple stable hand. Could the English lord he suspected have been Lord Seaton? Not his lordship, no. But he was some sort of relative of the Seatons. They both were. The English lord and the captain both." "And the stable hand? Who was he?" "Just some good-looking lad my mother fancied." "From Northcote Abbey?" She tipped her head to one side, her gaze on his face. And he knew she both sensed and understood the quiet desperation that drove his questions. "No, from Maplethorpe Hall." He thought for a moment she meant to say something more, that she knew more. Then she turned and entered the cottage, closing the door behind her. Chapter 43. Sebastian was headed back toward the Blue Boar when he noticed Reuben Dickey sitting on the pump-house step, his head bowed over his carving. "I've been looking for you," said Sebastian, walking over to him. Reuben froze, his eyes darting this way and that, as if he were thinking of bolting.
"Mama said you was. It's 'cause of the book, ain't it? I already told the lady. I don't remember where I found it."
"Do you remember when you found it?" Reuben shook his head slowly back and forth.
"It's been a while."
"Was it by the river, or somewhere else?"
"I dunno."
"Did you find anything with it?" Reuben's nostrils flared on a suddenly indrawn breath.
"What would I find with it?"
"A satchel, or a sketchbook, perhaps?"
"No. Oh, no."
The man was an appallingly bad liar. Sebastian said, "You won't get into trouble for it, you know. In fact, you'd be a hero for finding something we've all been looking for." Reuben dug the toe of one clog into the dirt.
"You're trying to trick me, aren't you? You think I'm stupid. Well, I'm not stupid."
Sebastian tried a different tack. "I hear you like to go out at night."
"I ain't supposed to go out at night."
"But you do sometimes, don't you?" Reuben shook his head again, harder and faster this time.
"Things happen at night. Things people don't want you to see."
"Oh? Such as?" Reuben quit shaking his head as a sly smile crept over his features.
"You don't know, do you? You think I'm so stupid. But there's lots of things I knows that you don't."
Sebastian leaned against one of the pump-house's worn columns and crossed his arms at his chest.
"If I wanted to find out about those things, where would you suggest I look?"
Reuben's tongue crept out to lick his lips.
"Depends what things you want to know about."
Sebastian simply stared at Reuben expectantly, and after a moment his silence goaded the other man into saying,
"Ain't nothing there now. But if you'd looked in Maplethorpe Hall's old carriage house a few days ago, you might have seen something."
"How many days ago?"
"Oh, maybe around the time that pretty young widow was killed,"
Reuben said airily, and went back to his whittling. Sebastian watched the man's short, incredibly deft fingers peel away curls of wood to reveal what he now realized was a badger.
"Saw her too, you know,"
said Reuben abruptly.
"You mean the night before she was killed?"
Reuben sucked his lower lip between his small, oddly spaced teeth as he focused on his carving.
"I ain't allowed out at night, remember? But she was up real early that morning."
"You saw Emma Chandler on Monday morning?" Reuben kept his attention focused on his carving.
"Mm-hmm." Did she have her sketchbook with her?
What's a sketchbook?
The notebook she drew pictures in. Was it significant, Sebastian wondered, that Reuben hadn't asked, "What's a sketchbook?" when Sebastian first inquired after it?
Reckon she did,
said Reuben. Where did you see her, Reuben? And don't pretend you don't remember, because I won't believe you. Sebastian said it with just enough menace in his voice that Reuben's hands went slack, the knife tumbling from his grasp as his mouth formed a startled, "Oh."
"The old Packbridge, down past Maplethorpe,"
he said in a rush, scrambling after his knife.
"She was painting a picture of it in that notebook of hers. What do you call it?"
"A sketchbook. Did you speak with her?"
"Just to say she was up awful early."
"And what did she say?"
"She said she hadn't been able to sleep, so she figured she may as well come paint the sunrise."
"At the Packbridge?" Reuben nodded vigorously.
"Said it was real pretty, she did."
A single arch of dark old red brick, the Packbridge was a relic of an earlier age, when England's roads were so abysmal that most goods were hauled across country not in wagons or by canals, but on pack animals. Its track was narrow and seldom used now, but not entirely abandoned. Sebastian stood on the grassy bank of the River Teme, with the tip of his riding crop tapping against his high-topped boots. The sun was beginning to sink in the sky, the air heavy with the scent of the mint that grew in the dark, damp shadows of the bridge. It was an out-of-the-way, deserted place for a young woman to visit alone, even in broad daylight. What the hell had possessed Emma to come here early on the morning of the day she was fated to die? He climbed back up the bank to where he had left his rented hack, his gaze narrowing as he turned again to study the track that crossed the bridge and disappeared into the wasteland on the opposite bank. A marshy, uncultivated stretch of bracken and scrub, it extended as far as he could see. But somewhere to the south, he knew, lay the estuary of the River Severn and the Bristol Channel, and beyond that, the North Atlantic Ocean. And France. Maplethorpe's caretaker gardener, Silas Madden, was weeding a bed at the far end of the water garden when Sebastian turned into the old hall's once grand, formal drive. Sebastian continued on around the ruined, blackened walls of the burned house to where the stable block and carriage house still stood. He dismounted, his gaze on the wagon ruts he'd noticed that first day, dry and crumbling now in the heat of the afternoon. From the distance came a man's shout. Sebastian ignored him. A long, narrow structure, built of the same red brick as the burned hall, the carriage house was quite large, with a row of 6 arched double doors. Each door sported a well-oiled and surprisingly heavy hasp and padlock, although most of the locks hung open.
"Ain't nothing there now,"
Reuben had said. Sebastian thrust open the first set of doors, the afternoon sun throwing his shadow before him across the beaten earth floor. It was a cavernous space, once home to travelling carriages, tilburys, whiskies, and dog carts, but empty now, except for a pile of discarded sacking, some cracked old harness hanging on a wall, and several bales of hay that looked very new indeed. A number of incongruous but undeniable scents lingered in the dusty air, pungent aromas left by recent stores of tobacco, wine, and brandy. A noise from the near door brought Sebastian's head around. His gaze met Silas's. "Tell Weston I want to see him," said Sebastian. "Here. Now." Chapter 44. Major Eugene Weston arrived in less than 10 minutes. By then, Sebastian was seated on a stone bench in the lee of one of the garden's high yew hedges. The Major came striding up the track through the spinney, arms swinging, face red from a combination of physical exertion and righteous indignation. He drew up abruptly at the sight of Sebastian. "P.3," blustered Weston, hands clenched into fists at his sides. It's not exactly the dumb thing now, is it? Poking about without anybody's leave? Sending a man messages by his servants? How would you like it if—"
"In my experience," said Sebastian, crossing his arms at his chest and leaning back in his seat, "smuggling gangs have a nasty habit of turning lethal when they find themselves in danger of being exposed. Is that what happened? Did Emma Chandler accidentally stumble into your little operation here? Is that why you killed her?"
"Kill her? Me? What a preposterous notion! And as for smuggling—"
Weston gave a tinny laugh.
"This isn't exactly Cornwall or Kent."
"True. Which makes it so much easier to manoeuvre, doesn't it? Far more comfortable to land your goods near Newport or Chepstow without all those annoying revenue officers sticking their noses into everything. Part of each cargo is probably sent directly to Hereford and Worcestershire, while from here you can supply all of Shropshire and a good section of the hills of eastern Wales as well." Weston gave Sebastian a wooden stare.
"I don't know what you're talking about."
Sebastian heaved a pained sigh, his gaze on the Major's flushed, sweaty face. "You basically have two options. You can tell me what I need to know, or you can answer some decidedly awkward questions posed by His Majesty's revenue men." Weston spread his arms wide and smiled.
"There's nothing here for anyone to find."
"Not now, but that can be fixed." A smile slid off the Major's face.
"What does that mean?"
"Use your imagination. And if you take one more step, Silas," Sebastian added calmly, as he shifted his weight to draw a small double-barreled flintlock pistol from his pocket, "I'll blow your bloody head off. First yours, and then the Major's." Silas, who had been sidling toward him along the hedge with a pitchfork gripped purposefully in his hands, froze as Sebastian pulled back both hammers with an audible click. Weston turned a sickly shade.
"That will be all, Silas," he said,
his voice wheezing.
"Thank you."
For a moment, Silas looked as if he might balk. Then he shouldered his pitchfork and turned toward the stables. Sebastian shifted the muzzle of his pistol to the Major. "Make up your mind. I don't have all afternoon." Weston waited until the caretaker was out of earshot, then cleared his throat, a tick spasming the flesh beside his right eye.
"I have your word as a gentleman that if I answer your questions, you won't inform the revenue men?"
"Not unless I discover Emma Chandler was killed because of your little adventure." Weston licked his dry lips.
"What do you want to know?"
"What night did your latest cargo arrive?"
"A week ago, yesterday."
"Sunday night?"
"Yes."
"And you sent it on again when?"
"The next night."
"So, Monday?" Weston nodded, his jaw thrust forward in a way that pursed his lips. The shipment would have been brought in from the estuary by pack horses, then reloaded here into wagons and sent on its way buried beneath grain or some other legitimate product. And Sebastian found himself thinking about Reuben Dickey's brother, Jeb, and the shipment of timber he'd recently hauled to Wales. "That's the night Emma Chance was killed," said Sebastian.
"Yes, but the one has nothing to do with the other, absolutely nothing."
"Emma Chance didn't come back here again that evening and see something you didn't want her to see?"
"Of course not. How careless do you imagine we are?"
"And you're certain the shipment wasn't already in the carriage house the day she came to sketch the hall?"
"No, I tell you. It arrived that night, long after she'd finished and gone away. Besides, Silas was watching her the entire time she was here, just in case she got too curious."
"Pitchfork at the ready, one assumes."
"Don't be ridiculous."
"And the next night? What time did the wagons leave?"
"Just before dawn. So Tuesday morning, actually. Any earlier, and there's always a danger of arousing suspicions."
"Were you here Sunday night?"
"Good God, no. You don't seriously think I deal with any of this myself?"
"No," said Sebastian. Weston's role was undoubtedly minimal and would extend little beyond supplying the critically necessary funds. Smuggling was a lucrative but capital-intensive business. Because customers paid for their smuggled goods only on delivery, the money to finance each run up front had to come from the likes of merchants and landowners, wealthy men who risked their investment but not their lives. The real dangers were run by others, by the crews of the black-hulled cutters that plied the channel, by the fishermen who ferried the cargo ashore in their small boats, by the impoverished, starving countryfolk who served as tubmen and batsmen, or who guided ponies loaded with anchors of brandy and wine, or oilskin-wrapped packets of tobacco, silk, and lace. Moving under cover of darkness from one isolated safe house to the next, they were the ones who ferried the goods inland, the hooves of their pack animals muffled with rags. They were the ones who faced death or transportation if caught. But while their risks were high, they were paid pennies. The handsome profits generated by their labours were pocketed by men like Weston, who were seldom caught. Yes, he allowed the old Hall's carriage house to function as a way station, but if it were ever discovered, he could simply claim it was used without his permission or knowledge. The actual management of the operation would be handled by someone else, someone with the kind of skills needed to negotiate with ship's captains and coordinate the labourers who actually moved the goods. Someone who probably didn't even live in Ayleswick.
"What about Monday night?" said Sebastian. "Were you here then?"
"Of course not. What do you think, that I plough my own fields and shear my own sheep as well?"
"So how do you know what actually happened on either night?"
"Because I would have been told, had anything untoward occurred."
"Silas handles everything here, does he?"
"He's very reliable."
"I've no doubt that he is," said Sebastian. "How long have you been dabbling in the free trade?" Weston's jaw jutted out mulishly.
"What the devil business is it of yours?"
Sebastian pushed to his feet.
"If you'd rather answer the questions of His Majesty's revenue men."
15 years,
snapped Weston.
"What else was I to do after Liv wheedled her father into leaving his will the way he did? He was in his dotage by then, you know. The will should never have been allowed to stand, but it was. So what would you have me live on? Pin money doled out by my own wife, just so she can waste the ready on her damned gardens? I had no choice."
"It's her fault, is it?"
"Of course it is."
Weston stared at him, eyes wide, nostrils flaring with his hard, quick breaths. Sebastian studied the man's flushed, overfed countenance.
"Do you remember a young woman named Lady Emily Turnstall?"
Weston looked confused.
"Who?" "Lady Emily Turnstall. She attended a house party given by the Irvings in September of 1791. She was just 16, and very pretty."
Weston huffed a disbelieving laugh.
"Do you seriously think I remember every green girl I ever met?"
"She was the daughter of the Earl of Haworth, quite richly dowered."
Weston shook his head.
"Sorry. If I ever met her, I don't recall it. What has she to do with anything?"
"How about Alex Dalrymple?" said Sebastian, ignoring the question. "The man who was gibbeted in 1793. You do recall him, don't you?"
"Of course I do. Radical bastard. If you ask me, he should have been drawn and quartered as well as gibbeted."
"Why?"
"What do you mean, why? The brute terrorised the entire parish for months. If he'd had his way, they'd have set up a guillotine on the village green. No man or women of birth or breeding would have been spared."
"Took it personally, did you?"
"Who wouldn't take it personally?"
His tone was one of moral outrage, but there was an element of bluster there, too, that told Sebastian the man was being less than honest about any number of things. Chapter 45. The discovery that Ayleswick was part of an established smuggling conduit opened up a disturbing new possibility. Free traders had long been used by both London and Paris to secretly slip men and messages back and forth across the Channel, and Sebastian had no doubt that Paris had moved quickly to exploit a smuggling operation that was already in existence when Lucien Bonaparte arrived in Shropshire as a paroled prisoner of war. From his days as an exploring officer, Sebastian knew enough about the way these things worked to have a pretty good understanding of how messages would move along the route, first to Ayleswick, and then to whatever trusted courier finally delivered the sealed packets to Bonaparte himself. It was possible Eugene Weston knew his smuggling operation was being exploited by Paris, although Sebastian found that unlikely. The man's role was that of financier and nothing more. Yet given the distance of some 30 or more miles between Ayleswick and the Bonapartes' estate in Worcestershire, forwarding such messages would have been both time-consuming and delicate. Was that the real reason Lucien had brought his family to spend the summer at Northcote Abbey? To be in closer contact with Paris, now that the situation on the continent was sliding toward disaster? Were the repairs to his estate simply a convenient excuse? And if so, what was Lady Seaton's role in all this? Did she know of her guest's contact with Paris? Or was she simply being used? Pondering the possibilities, Sebastian rode through the village, then spurred his horse on to Northcote Abbey. As he rounded a bend thickly planted with rhododendrons, a vista opened up before him, and he found himself looking down on the ornamental lake, its normally placid, reflective surface now ruffled by a stiffening breeze. A familiar figure, clothed in breeches, high-top boots, and a well-tailored coat, paced back and forth before the picturesquely sited Roman temple. Sebastian checked for a moment, then wheeled his horse down the slope toward the lake. The drum of hoofbeats brought Lucien Bonaparte around, his brow furrowed with the agonies of poetic composition. But at the sight of Sebastian, his face cleared.
"Good afternoon, my lord. This is a pleasant surprise."
Sebastian swung from the saddle and dropped easily to the ground.
"Good evening, Senator. How is the epic coming?"
Lucien Bonaparte heaved a weary sigh.
"There is a reason the ancients personified the muses as female. I fear Calliope is a fickle creature, capricious and at times damnably difficult to woo." "You come here every day to write?"
asked Sebastian, his attention shifting to the folly beside them. Although built as a ruin, the temple's roof was more than solid enough to provide a poetically minded guest with shelter from sun and rain. Through the single row of thick Doric columns, Sebastian could see that Lady Seaton had even softened the temple's stone benches with mounds of plump cushions in delicate shades of teal and peach.
"Every day, except Sunday, from 10 to 1,
said the senator with obvious pride.
"And sometimes, as today, I return again to work in the late afternoon. Art requires dedication." "It does, it does."
Lucien's good-humoured smile remained in place, but his eyes were shrewd and watchful. This man was no fool. He knew Sebastian wasn't here to discuss his epic poem on Charlemagne.
"So tell me, my lord, how is your investigation into these dreadful murders progressing?"
"It's interesting, actually. I've just discovered that a shipment of French spirits passed through Ayleswick the very day Emma Chandler was killed." Lucien Bonaparte kept his face admirably blank.
"Oh?"
And it occurs to me that a message may have come with it. Say, from Napoleon to you." In the sudden tense silence, Sebastian could hear a thrush singing in a nearby stand of beech, and the gentle slap of the wind-ruffled water lapping against the reeds edging the lake. The Corsican cleared his throat. "My brother and I are estranged. That is why I fled the continent."
"Oh, I've no doubt you quarrelled."
"Napoleon has quarrelled, sometimes violently, with every one of his brothers and sisters multiple times over the years. But yours is still an extraordinarily close family. You always seem to make up your differences and come to each other's aid when threatened. And Napoleon has never been more threatened than he is now." Lucien Bonaparte brought up a hand to tug at his earlobe, his dark eyes hooded, his gaze on the lake.
"What worries me," said Sebastian, is the thought that Emma Chandler might somehow have stumbled upon a meeting between you and your brother's messenger, and that's why she was killed.
But there is no communication between my brother and me.
What about between you and your mother?
Bonaparte fiddled with the chain of his pocket watch.
I am allowed to send letters to my mother through the commissioner.
And if you wish to say something you don't want the commissioner and everyone at Whitehall to read? Unfortunately, that is one of the inescapable trials of being a prisoner. Not so inescapable, surely. Bonaparte drew himself up to his full height.
Monsieur, one of the conditions of a gentleman's parole is that he not communicate with anyone except through the commissioners. I have given my word. You insult me.
Do I?
Sebastian met the senator's outraged gaze.
He'd learned long ago that the rulers of this world operate on a different moral plane than other mere mortals. Their decisions, whether careless or calculated, often wreaked suffering and death on a scale unimaginable to anyone else. Taken altogether, Sebastian figured the Bonaparte brothers were collectively responsible for the deaths of anywhere between 3 and 6 million people. When set against that level of carnage, what difference would the murder of one insignificant young woman make to someone like Lucien Bonaparte? And as he studied the Corsican's swarthy Mediterranean features, so similar to those of his more famous older brother in his prime, Sebastian knew a rush of raw anger and revulsion that he controlled with difficulty. If your presence in Ayleswick has anything to do with these murders, said Sebastian, anything, then the deaths of both Emma Chandler and Hannibal Pierce are on your head and on your soul. Think about that while you wrestle with your recalcitrant muse, said Sebastian. And he walked off and left Bonaparte there, beside the wind-ruffled lake and its pillow-filled folly. Chapter 46. That evening, Sebastian and Archie met to compare notes over brandy in the Grange's ancient oak-panelled hall. A relic of a bygone era, the hall was a cavernous space with a soaring truss-oaked roof, thick walls, and flagstone paving. Even on an August night, it was chilly enough to warrant a small fire on the vast, old-fashioned hearth. Archie listened, his face grim, while Sebastian told what he'd learned of Emma Chandler's determination to identify the man who had raped her mother.
My God,
said the young squire when Sebastian had finished.
Could my own father have done something like that? His name was on her list.
Sebastian took a slow sip of his brandy.
What colour was your father's hair?
Lighter than mine. Why?
Because whoever raped Lady Emily was dark. It's probably why Emma crossed off his name. She somehow discovered your father was fair.
Archie stared at him.
She did. She actually asked me.
And she did it so adroitly it didn't even occur to me to wonder at it.
He thrust up from his saggy armchair and went to throw another log on the fire.
Then he stood with a palm braced against the aged chimney-piece as he stared down at the flames.
This changes everything, doesn't it?
He said after a moment. How horrifying to think she could have tracked down her father, only to have him kill her for it. If he did, it narrows our list of suspects considerably.
Archie looked over at him questioningly.
Sebastian said, Like your father, Samuel Atwater is fair. Leopold Seaton and Jamie Knox are dead, and we both know Reuben Dickey is incapable of concocting such an elaborate ruse. Which leaves Underwood and Weston.
Have you spoken with them?
Not Underwood, but Weston denies even remembering Lady Emily.
Well, he would, wouldn't he?
Sebastian swirled the golden-brown liquid in his glass and said nothing. He had decided not to tell Archie about his discovery that afternoon at Mablethorpe Hall, or of his subsequent conversation with Lucien Bonaparte. Partially it was because he had given Weston his word as a gentleman that he wouldn't report his activities to the customs officials, and he suspected that wouldn't sit well with the earnest young justice of the peace. But it was also because he was beginning to realize that Archie had a tendency to go off half-cocked
after each bit of new information, and Sebastian wasn't yet convinced that what he'd learned had anything to do with Emma Chandler's murder.
"I'll admit I've never liked the man," Archie was saying, "and my father abominated him. But do you actually think Weston is capable of murdering a young woman he thought was his own daughter? We know he once seduced an innocent young girl simply to get his hands on her wealth. So I'd say yes. Someone that selfish could conceivably kill if he felt his interests or security were threatened. He'd simply convince himself the murder was the victim's own fault for asking questions about something that happened 22 years ago."
Sebastian paused.
"Or for being so thoughtless as to fall pregnant."
Archie's features had taken on a pinched, troubled look.
"In other words, Sybil Moss and Hannah Grant."
Sebastian nodded.
"I can't get past the idea that their deaths are linked to what's happening today. In my experience, once a man kills, it becomes much easier for him to kill again. Because he thinks that if he got away with it once, he can get away with it again. That's part of it. But there's also a certain kind of man who discovers he enjoys killing. He likes the feeling of power it gives him. I must say, that does sound rather like Weston." "It does, yes."
Sebastian drained his brandy.
"Tell me about the Ludlow solicitors."
It had taken Archie most of the day to track down the right solicitors, an old firm called Bieber and Smythe, with offices on a narrow, winding street near the castle. Then the principal partner, Daniel Bieber, had insisted on accompanying him back to Ayleswick to view Emma Chandler's body and personally verify that she was indeed dead.
"Was he satisfied it's her?"
asked Sebastian.
"Said he was, after he finished casting up his accounts behind one of the tombs in the churchyard. Thank God the Reverend will be able to bury her in the morning. I don't think anyone will be able to recognize her soon."
"Did Bieber tell you who she named in her will?" asked Sebastian.
"He balked at it initially, but he finally had to agree it might be important. Seems she left everything to that former teacher of hers up in Little Stretton."
"Jane Owens?"
"Yes."
Sebastian watched the flames lick up around the new log on the hearth, his thoughts drifting to the sad-eyed woman in the simple thatched cottage beside the River Ashes Hollow. He knew, even without being told, how Jane Owens would use Emma's money to open the school for chance children that had been the young woman's dream.
"There's something else,"
said Sebastian, as Archie moved to refresh their drinks.
"Something Lady Devlin discovered." "Oh?"
While Archie poured another hearty measure of brandy in each glass, Sebastian told the young squire about the Reverend's edition of Hamlet.
"You're saying the killer stole Underwood's copy of the play?"
Archie set aside the decanter.
"But why would he do that?"
Sebastian took the glass he held out.
"Because he's too clever by half. He tucked the line from Hamlet into Emma's hand to reinforce the impression that she'd killed herself. But at the same time, the book could also be used to throw suspicion on the vicar if we ever realized her death was actually murder."
Archie came to sprawl in his chair again.
"But unless the killer knew why Emma was here, what possible motive could he imagine the vicar might have?" "None that I can see. Which brings us to the second possibility." "Which is?" "That the Reverend Benedict Underwood is himself the killer, and he never intended his book to turn up."
Archie's eyes widened.
"Good God!"
Sebastian drained his glass in one long pull.
"We need to know where Reuben Dickey found that damned book." "I'll get it out of him first thing in the morning," said Archie, "even if I have to beat it out of him."
But it was just after dawn the next morning, when a cottager collecting firewood in the wasteland along the river found Reuben dead. Chapter 47. Tuesday, 10th of August. Reuben Dickey lay sprawled face down at a gravelly bend in the Team, his arms flung wide, the side of his head a pulpy, bloody mess. More blood soaked the back of his smock, where a jagged slice in the worn cloth
showed a gaping purple wound in the pale flesh beneath. He was close enough to the water's edge that one hand bobbed with the movements of the river as pond skaters flitted around his stiffening, puffy white fingers.
"Looks like he was stabbed in the back and had his head bashed in,"
said Archie, his face grim and slicked with sweat as he batted at the flies buzzing around them. Sebastian crouched down beside the body. Someone obviously wanted to make quite sure he was dead. Reuben's one visible eye stared back at him, wide and filmed with the beginnings of decay. From the distance came the slow, mournful echo of the funeral toll. The vicar had decided to go ahead with Emma Chandler's funeral, despite the discovery of yet another murder, which meant that Constable Nash wouldn't be along until he'd finished his duties as bell ringer and sexton.
"How long do you think he's been dead?"
asked Archie, making no move to come any closer. Sebastian yanked off a glove to touch the dead man's cheek.
"A while. He's cold." "What I don't understand is, why would a killer go through the trouble of carefully staging Emma Chandler's death, and the others before her, to look like suicides or accidents, only to now start shooting people or bashing in their skulls?"
Because once we'd figured out Emma's death wasn't a suicide, there really was no point anymore, was there?
"I suppose not."
Archie cast an uncomfortable glance around.
"Was he killed here, do you think?"
"It looks like it, but then I'm no expert. The gravel strikes me as rather convenient." Archie shook his head.
"I don't understand."
"No footprints."
"Ah, yes."
Archie stared across the river at a flock of geese that had been turned out into a recently harvested field. Later, cows would be set to graze on the stover, and later still, sheep. In the spring, the dung and the roots would all be ploughed under in preparation for the planting of a new season's crop. After a moment, Archie said,
"Who would want to kill Reuben? I mean, yes, he could be damnably annoying, but he was essentially harmless."
"Whoever killed him obviously didn't think so." An oilskin satchel lay half-hidden beneath the dead man's body, and Sebastian carefully eased it free. "Ever seen Reuben with anything like this?"
"No."
"Then I think we know where he got it." The satchel opened to reveal a lady's plain black reticule, a selection of drawing pencils, 2 erasers, and a large sketchbook.
"Good God!"
said Archie, his hands falling to his sides.
"It's Emma Chandler's."
His gaze met Sebastian's.
"Could Reuben have killed her after all?"
"If he did, then who killed Reuben?" Archie huffed a startled laugh.
"Ah, I hadn't thought of that."
Sebastian opened the sketchbook to find himself staring at a peaceful, idyllic watercolour of the village green. "I think it more likely that Reuben came upon Emma Chandler's body sometime late Monday night or early Tuesday morning, before young Charles Bonaparte found her."
"And simply took her satchel? What a ghoulish thing to do. Was the book with it, do you think?"
"Perhaps, perhaps not. But if it was, and he did take the satchel from her body, it certainly explains why he didn't want to say where or when he'd found the vicar's book." Sebastian flipped several pages in the sketchbook and stopped at a sombre charcoal drawing of the churchyard. What it doesn't explain is why he was killed. "And here I was thinking the second sketchbook had disappeared because its contents would somehow implicate Emma's killer," said Hero. They were in their private parlour at the Blue Boar. Sebastian had laid Emma's sketchbook open on the small round table beneath the window. "I thought the same," said Sebastian, beginning to turn the pages. The first sketches were general scenes of the village, most done in pencil or charcoal, with a few more detailed studies in watercolours. There was the green, with its time-worn pump-house and a couple of fat ducks waddling across the grass. Then came pictures of the gently curving high street and the row of picturesque half-timbered cottages that lined the green. And it occurred to Sebastian that it was possible to follow the passage of Emma's days at Ayleswick simply by noting the order of her pictures. On Saturday morning, at the same time she'd drawn Archie's portrait, she'd also sketched some half-dozen views of the Grange's ancient ivy-draped tower and quiet moat. Invited to Northcote Abbey that afternoon by Lady Seton, Emma had drawn the graceful old house from several angles, as well as the Greek temple overlooking the park's ornamental lake and the famous Long Gallery. "Ah," said Hero, staring at Emma's exquisite rendering of the long, narrow room's soaring windows and elaborately plastered ceiling. "She must have asked Lady Seton to show her the family portraits. Clever." Simon started fussing from his rug near the cold hearth, and Sebastian went to pick up the boy, swinging him high. "Is there a portrait of Leopold Seton in the Long Gallery?" "There is, yes. Lady Seton pointed it out to me. He was a startlingly handsome man." "As is Crispin." "Yes, but I didn't see much of a resemblance between father and son. The father was dark-haired." "Which explains why Emma didn't cross his name off her list," said Sebastian, coming to stand beside Hero again as she turned the next page. They found themselves staring at the ruins of Mablethorpe Hall. Emma had drawn the house at eerie angles, so that the blackened walls seemed to loom over the viewer in a way that made it appear oppressive, almost threatening. Must have been strange for her, visiting the burned-out husk of the house that had played such a pivotal role in her mother's life, said Hero. I wonder if she knew before she came here that the hall had burned. She may have heard about it from Crispin or his sisters. They must surely have spoken to her of their village long before she realised her own connection to Ayleswick. Hero looked over at him. I hadn't thought of that. Most of the names in her mother's letter were probably already familiar to her. Emma had drawn some half-dozen sketches of the burned old hall before moving on to the crossroads, where she captured the melancholy of the nearly abandoned hamlet and the bedraggled thatch and leaning chimneys of the ship. Then came a haunting image of the gibbet, its blackened arm stark against a glaring sky. Do you think she did all these drawings to support her story of being on a sketching expedition? Said Hero. Or was she simply intent on recording her father's village? Could have been both. Hero flipped the page to reveal an unexpectedly pastoral scene, with cows grazing on the side of a long grassy mound set against a background of old oaks. What the devil is that? Said Sebastian, as Simon began to fuss again. Hero reached out to take the baby. Mr. McBroom was telling me there's an ancient barrow several miles to the east of here, on the way to Ludlow. This must be it. Sebastian studied the low earthen mound, noting now the weathered stones thrusting up from the grass at one rounded end. So when did Emma go there? And why? He turned the page to find himself staring at a beautifully detailed watercolour of the Pack Bridge, its single brick arch silhouetted against a rising sun. This was obviously painted on Monday morning. So she must have walked out to the barrow on Sunday evening. Why would she do that? He looked up, his gaze meeting Hero's, but she simply shook her head. After the watercolour of the bridge came several drawings of Ayleswick's squat Norman church, then a sketch of a majestic rose window rising empty and solemn against a cloudless sky. The Priory, said Hero. There were two more drawings of the ruins. In one, a scruffy mongrel Sebastian recognised as the Seton's dog Barney trotted nose down along the remnants of the cloister. The other was a striking view of the ruins of the chapter house. The next page was blank. Well, hell, said Sebastian. Hero shifted Simon's weight to her hip. Let me see the sketch of the barrow again. Sebastian flipped back to the earlier drawing. It had rained later that evening, and Emma had drawn the storm clouds already pressing down dark and threatening over the landscape. But now, as he studied the ancient tumulus and the stand of trees that encroached upon it, he realised the scene was not entirely deserted. A half-grown, dark-haired boy in nankeens and a torn short coat stood near the trees, his head thrown back as he watched a peregrine circling overhead. Good heavens, said Hero. That looks like Charles Bonaparte. Sunday, said the Emperor Napoleon's precocious young nephew. He sat on the top rail of the paddock fence where Hero and Sebastian had found him watching a groom put a colt through its paces. Yes, I was out by the barrow. Why? Do you recall seeing Emma Chandler there? Asked Hero. Charles looked confused. Chandler? We've discovered that was Emma Chance's actual name, explained Sebastian. Was it really? The boy's eyes brightened with interest. You mean she was here under an alias? What was she? A spy? An assassin? Did you see her at the barrow? Sebastian asked again. Yes, sir. He gripped the top rail and swung his legs back and forth in a way that reminded them that he was still very much a child. She asked what I knew about the place. I told her that long barrows like that date back to the Stone Age and were probably used for burial chambers. She was very interested. His eagerness faded away. She was a nice lady. I'm sorry she's dead. Did you see the picture she drew out there? I did, yes. She showed it to me. I wish I could draw like that. Wouldn't it be grand? Which of you left first? Asked Hero. The boy looked from Hero to Sebastian and back again. She did. Why? Sebastian said, Did she walk toward the village? I don't think I noticed which way she turned when she left. But I did see her again, later, when I was on my way home. Oh? She was near the top of that small rise. You know the one, just before you reach the crossroads. What was she doing? She was just standing by the hedgerow, talking to Crispin. The boy hesitated, then added, I think she was crying. And Crispin, he looked as angry as all get out. Sebastian stared at him. You mean Crispin Seaton? Yes, sir. Are you certain? Asked Hero. Oh, yes, ma'am, said young Master Bonaparte. I don't think he saw me because he was focused so intently on her. But I remember it because I was surprised to see him. I thought he was still in the Lake District. Did you tell anyone you'd seen him? Asked Sebastian. I said something to Mamma the next day, but he never showed up at Northcote, and my mother told me I must have been mistaken. Do you think you were? Charles Bonaparte met his gaze, and there was something about his expression that made the boy seem older than his years. I know I wasn't. Chapter 48. Crispin Seaton sat beside the raw earth of Emma Chandler's grave, his head bowed, his forearms resting on spread knees. He didn't look up when Sebastian walked across the sunlit grass toward him. The sky was still brutally cloudless, and Crispin's small bunch of meadow daisies and poppies was already beginning to wilt in the heat. Sebastian said, I'm sorry. The younger man nodded, his throat working hard as he swallowed. I've been sitting here thinking about the first time I kissed her. The fields were dusted with a late snow, and it was so cold. Her nose was red like a child's. But then I kissed her, and her lips were so warm. I remember looking into her eyes, and they were so soft, so beautiful. I knew then that I could look at her forever, and never tire of it. And now? Now she's down there in the ground. She can't see or feel anything, and I'll never be able to touch or look at her again. Ever. Sebastian raised his gaze to stare up the hill toward the ruined medieval watchtower that stood guard over the village. You told me you heard about Emma Chance's death on your way back from the Lake District, and suspected she might be Emma Chandler. Except now I discover that you were actually here in Ayleswick that Sunday, the evening before she was killed. You saw her, and you spoke with her. So why the lie? Crispin held himself very still, his hands dangling limply. Then his head fell back, displaying a face ravaged by grief. How did you know? You were seen. The younger man's features pinched with puzzlement. But I didn't ride all the way into Ayleswick.
I hadn't even reached the crossroads when I saw her walking along the road." He drew in a shaky breath. "Couldn't believe it was her."
"You stopped?"
"Of course I stopped."
"Did she tell you why she was here?"
Crispin nodded, his throat working visibly as he swallowed.
"Why was she crying?"
Crispin stared at him. "How did you know she was crying?"
"I told you, you were seen."
It said something about the intensity of the exchange between the two young lovers that Seaton hadn't even noticed Charles Bonaparte trotting down the road behind them.
"Why was she crying?"
Crispin swiped a shaky hand over his face.
"We were arguing." "About what?"
"Does it matter?"
"I rather think it does."
The young Baron nodded and shifted to clasp his hands around his bent knees. "She told me she'd discovered her father was someone from Ayleswick, so she'd decided to come here, posing as an officer's widow on a sketching expedition, so she could find out who he was. I wanted to know how the blazes she thought we could ever marry, when everyone in the village now thought she was someone she wasn't."
"What did she say?"
He stared at the new grave before him. "She said, how could she marry me when there was a chance that my father was also her father?" Sebastian held himself very still. He was finding it oddly difficult to draw his next breath, much less ask the questions he needed to ask in a calm, even voice.
"Had she made any progress in discovering her father's identity?"
Crispin shook his head. "She said she'd eliminated the old squire because Archie told her his father was fair-haired, and Samuel Atwater for the same reason. But that was about it. I'm not quite certain I understand how she thought she could possibly discover the truth." "I don't know either. What was she going to do? Come right out and ask Major Weston if by chance he'd raped some earl's 16-year-old daughter 2 decades ago? Ask the vicar, for Christ's sake?" I had the impression she thought she'd somehow recognize her father when she saw him.
"Except that Emma looked like her mother," said Sebastian. "Why didn't you tell me this before?"
A faint hint of colour crept into the younger man's cheeks as his gaze drifted away. "I was afraid that if you knew I'd been here and then left, that we'd quarrelled, and you might think I'd killed her."
"Where did you go, after you came upon her on the road?"
"What do you think? My God, I just discovered that the woman I loved and wanted to marry thought there was a very good chance she was my sister. You can have no idea of what that's like. No idea at all." Sebastian stared out over the sun-soaked tombstones around them, conscious of a familiar pounding in his temples, because the truth was that he understood only too well what Crispin Seaton was going through. He'd been through it himself. "I turned my horse around and rode back to Ludlow," Crispin was saying. "I took a room at the Angel and set about getting mind-numbingly drunk. I stayed that way for days. It's all just a blur. I finally woke up on Friday, determined to ride back here and have it out with her. Except by then, everyone was talking about the inquests being held down in Ayleswick. I heard the name Emma Chance and—" His shoulders shook, and he dropped his face into his hands, muffling his voice. "I kept telling myself it had to be some kind of mistake. She couldn't be dead. She just couldn't." Sebastian understood now why Emma had told Reuben early Monday morning that she hadn't been able to sleep. Upset by the previous evening's confrontation with the man she loved, she'd finally given up even trying and left her bed before dawn to go down to the river to paint a pack bridge used by smugglers. She must have been exhausted all that day. And by dawn the next morning, she was dead. He studied the younger man's bowed head, the wind-ruffled fair hair gleaming golden in the sunlight. He believed Crispin Seaton's grief was genuine, but he knew, too, that Crispin wouldn't be the first murderer to weep at his victim's graveside. Chapter 49. Later that afternoon, as the sun sank toward the Welsh hills, Sebastian sat at the large central table in their private parlour, with Emma Chandler's 2 sketchbooks spread open before him.
he was comparing the sequence of her landscape sketches with that of her portraits. He stared at them a long time, trying to make sense of what he knew of this woman's death, and the others that had both flowed from it and preceded it. Finally, he said, "I know why Emma named the subjects of some of these portraits, but not others." Hero looked over at him from where she was mending one of Simon's dresses in a chair beside the window. "Why?" Her main purpose was obviously to draw and name each of the men mentioned in her mother's letter, but 3 were already dead, so she drew Archie in the hopes that he bore some resemblance to his dead father, and Jenny Dalrymple because she must somehow have realized the man at the ship referred to in her mother's letter was actually Jamie Knox, and Jenny is Knox's twin. So why did she draw Martin McBroom and Hannibal Pierce? Because she was an artist, and both men have interesting faces, as does the chambermaid Mary Beth. But she didn't name them because their identities weren't important. "She didn't draw Crispin," said Hero. "No, but she knew exactly what he looked like, didn't she?" They had found Crispin's last letter to Emma tucked into her reticule, and its presence there told them all they needed to know about her feelings toward him. Now Hero set aside her sewing and came to stand behind Sebastian, looking over his shoulder as he flipped slowly through the dead woman's drawings. She said, "Do you think Crispin could have killed Emma?" "I'd think it more likely if she'd died that night, if he'd killed her in a rage. But I find it difficult to believe that he rode off, only to come back 24 hours later to put his hand over her face and quietly smother her to death." "But he could have done it. He did lie." "He did. Although I'm beginning to think he may have lied to protect his mother." "Lady Seton?" Hero sank into the chair beside him. "You can't be serious." "I wish I weren't." She shook her head. "I'm not following you." "Let's suppose, for argument's sake, that the man who raped Lady Emily Turnstall 22 years ago was the same gentleman who impregnated Sybil Moss and Hannah Grant." "We don't know for certain that Hannah was with child." "No, but bear with me a moment. We've been assuming that Sybil and Hannah were killed by whatever gentleman seduced them, namely Lord Seton, the Reverend, or Major Weston, with Seton being eliminated because he's now dead. But what if those women were actually killed by the guilty man's angry, jealous wife?" "What a ghastly thought," said Hero. "Although, if you're right, it means Agnes Underwood and Liv Weston should also be considered suspects." "True, except Reverend Underwood and Major Weston are both still very much alive, whereas Leopold Seton is long dead. Supposedly, he fell off his horse one dark night riding home drunk from the Blue Boar and cracked his head open on a conveniently situated stone bridge." "You're suggesting his loving wife actually bashed in his head instead, and then killed Emma when she found out the young woman was her husband's child?" Hero was silent for a moment. "But Lady Seton didn't know why Emma was here." "We think she didn't know, but that doesn't mean she didn't. Apart from which, she could actually have an entirely different motive if Emma was killed because she accidentally stumbled upon a meeting between Lucien Bonaparte and someone delivering a message from Paris." "If there was a message from Paris that day, and if Lady Seton knows of Lucien's contact with Paris—" "That's 3 ifs," said Hero. Sebastian found himself smiling. "You're right, it is." Hero began slowly turning the pages of Emma's second sketchbook. "When one meets her, Lady Seton seems so feminine and even-tempered. Could she really be that different? That evil?" Sebastian stared down at Emma's sketch of Northcote Abbey, its leaded windows sparkling in the summer sunshine. Virtually every aspect of a gentlewoman's existence, from her tastes and talents to her behaviour and basic personality, was expected to conform to their society's narrow definition of womanhood. Some women were lucky. They were born fitting into that tight, predetermined mould.
but most struggled their entire lives to cope with the discrepancy between the reality of who they were and the illusion of what their society expected them to be. Some, like Hero, and he realized Emma Chandler, were independent-minded enough to go their own way, regardless of the consequences. But few were that brave. Most learned early to affect a false persona, to hide their intelligence and determination, and tuck away their true selves between a gentle, smiling, unnatural facade. And he had no doubt into which category Grace Seaton fell. I think Lady Seaton is very good at playing whatever role other people expect her to play. What she's actually like is anyone's guess. But how could she have managed it? Physically, I mean. She's so tiny. And then there's what happened to Hannibal Pierce. Even if she's a marvellous shot, I can't imagine her ladyship creeping through a misty churchyard with a rifled pistol to shoot Hannibal Pierce, or hiding in the bushes beside the river to leap out and bash Reuben Dickey over the head. No, but she has a very devoted cousin. Samuel Atwater? Hero considered this possibility in silence for a moment. Ironically, I can believe her capable of murder easier than I can him. I find him rather likable. So do I. Sebastian went to stare out the window at the lane leading up the hill to the ancient church, where a yellow-wheeled whiskey stood beside the lich gate, the reins of its glossy bay held by one of the village lads. Of course, it's always possible that Leopold Seaton really did fall off his horse and crack open his own head, and I should be looking into Liv Weston and a pitchfork-wielding gardener instead. Hero came to stand beside him, her gaze, like his, on the elegant woman now weaving her way through the churchyard's scattered tombstones. If you are right, how can you possibly prove it? I don't know. He turned away from the window and reached for his hat and gloves. Whoever is doing this has in all likelihood killed at least 6 people, and I have absolutely nothing but supposition to go on. Sebastian found Lady Seaton in the same place he'd come upon her son that morning, at Emma Chandler's graveside. She wore a demure light blue carriage dress with a round straw hat, her golden curls clustered poignantly about the pale, delicate features of her face. She held her hands nestled one inside the other, and pressed against the gown's high waistband, and she had her head bowed. But her eyes were open, and she appeared more lost in thought than engaged in prayer. At the sound of Sebastian's footfalls, she raised her head to look at him. She did not smile. A sheaf of purple heather and spiny yellow gorse rested against the new grave's bare dirt. It was a strange offering, but he didn't need to ask to know that she had brought it. She stared at him for a long moment, and he knew again the sense that this was a woman who kept all genuine thoughts and emotions carefully hidden from public scrutiny. She said, "Crispin told me of his conversation with you this morning." Sebastian stood on the far side of the grave, his hat dangling in one hand. "Did he tell you he was in love with Emma Chandler?" She nodded. "He confessed that to me days ago." Confessed? The word choice struck him as significant. She said, "Georgina had spoken to me several times of her friend at school, so I recognized her name once it became known." "She'd told you of Crispin's interest in Emma?" "No." She smiled faintly as she said it, drawing out the long vowel sound. "That she kept to herself. But then, Georgina and her brother have always been close. He asked her to keep it quiet, and she did." Lady Seaton fell silent again, her gaze dropping to the raw earth between them. "I wish she had told me why she was here. I might have been able to help her." Sebastian found his imagination boggling at the thought of Emma confiding to this elegant, cool gentlewoman her suspicions that Lady Seaton's dead husband might have been guilty of rape. He said, "You met Lady Emily Turnstall?" "I did, yes, but only briefly." "How much do you remember of that long-ago September?" "Little, I'm afraid.
I was increasing at the time, and most dreadfully unwell, but—" Her voice trailed off, her nostrils flaring on a suddenly indrawn breath. "Surely you're not suggesting that's why she was killed?"
I think it very likely, yes.
She ran her hands up and down her arms as if she were cold, although the evening was still golden warm. "And the others? Reuben Dickey and that man from London? What have they to do with a house party 22 years in the past?"
Probably nothing, but they may have seen something the night Emma was killed, something that could betray her killer's identity.
He hesitated, then said,
"It's possible the same person was also responsible for the deaths of Sybil Moss and Hannah Grant."
Her gaze flew to his, her pretty mouth going slack with surprise. He caught an unexpected flicker of what looked very much like fear lurking in her startlingly blue eyes. Then she lowered her thick lashes and looked away again. "But Sybil and Hannah committed suicide."
I think not.
She gave a little shake of her head. "Those women died years ago. How can you possibly think there's any connection between their deaths and what happened to Emma Chandler?"
Because someone in Ayleswick obviously likes to solve his problems with murder. Or her problems, thought Sebastian. Did you never consider it?
That the two girls hadn't killed themselves? She hesitated. "There was talk at the time, but I never credited it for an instant." What a troublesome thought. He said,
"I understand you invited Emma to Northcote on Saturday."
"I did, yes." She looked both puzzled and vaguely suspicious. "Why?"
"I was wondering how you met her."
"We were introduced by Agnes Underwood when I stopped by the vicarage Friday afternoon. She mentioned Emma was interested in sketching the historic buildings in the area, and I suggested she visit Northcote Abbey."
"Did she ask about your late husband?"
A faint frown puckered her pretty forehead. "She may have. I don't recall now exactly what we spoke of." She gathered her skirts. "And now you must excuse me, my lord. I don't like to leave Devon, my horse, waiting too long." He watched her walk away, her head held high, her features comfortably settled into a look of gentle goodwill she'd been practicing since childhood. Before he left the churchyard himself, Sebastian turned to enter the old parish church. The passage of the most recent Catholic Relief Act had enabled the Seatons to build a small, unobtrusive Catholic chapel on the grounds of Northcote Abbey. But for generations before that, the family had had to hide their faith, attending services at the village church on Sunday and burying their dead in its crypt. Built without aisles, the Church of St. Thomas was the same age as the earliest construction of the priory that now lay in ruins to the west. Its sandstone walls were thick, its windows small and rounded, the air permeated with the odour of cold, dank stone, and lost centuries of incense and blessed candles. Memorials to those interred in the crypt below lined the worn sandstone walls and floor of the nave. The oldest were those dedicated to the first generations of Rawlinses, but the most elaborate were those of the Seaton family. It didn't take Sebastian long to find the engraved marble slab of Lady Seaton's lord. Leopold Seaton had died on the 6th of February, 1798, less than 2 weeks after Hannah Grant was found floating in the mill pond. A coincidence? Possibly, but Sebastian doubted it. He was turning away when another memorial caught his eye, this one small and heartbreaking in its brevity. Shelby William, beloved son of Leopold and Grace Seaton, 2nd of November, 1797, to 16th of April, 1798. Sebastian stared at that pitiful memorial, conscious of an upwelling of empathy for the beautiful, self-contained woman who had buried her infant son within months of losing her husband. He searched the surrounding memorials, wondering if she had lost other children, but found no evidence of any. In her 7 years of marriage, Grace Seaton had given birth not to 3, but to 4 children. Crispin, the son and heir, followed by 2 girls, Georgina and Louisa, and then finally a second son. And 3 months later, Leopold Seton was dead. Sebastian tilted his head, his gaze on the mellow blues, greens, and reds of the stained glass window above the altar. The land and wealth of noble families were traditionally entailed, thus enabling the family's fortune to pass virtually intact from eldest son to eldest son on down through the ages. Failing a son, both land and titles would pass instead to the nearest male in the paternal line, be he a brother, nephew, uncle, or distant cousin. Any noblewoman left widowed without a son was generally to be pitied, for her home and her husband's wealth would all pass to some distant relative. As a result, most wives were anxious to bear not just one healthy son, but 2. An heir and a spare, they called it. And shortly after the birth of his spare, Lord Seton had died. A coincidence? Possibly. But a murderous woman, unwilling to tolerate her lord's philandering any longer, might well wait until after the birth of a second son before putting an end to her husband's straying once and for all. It was past time, Sebastian realized, that he learn more about the death of Leopold, Lord Seton. Chapter 50. Wednesday, 11th of August. The next morning dawned cool and blustery, with thick clouds that hung low enough to obscure the mountains to the west. With Archie at his side, Sebastian rode out to the old stone bridge where Leopold, Lord Seton, had died. "I was still a small boy when it happened," said Archie, reining in at the edge of the weathered fieldstone bridge that spanned a small rivulet some 100 yards from Northcote Abbey's gatehouse. "But I still remember listening to my father talk about how Lord Seton's brains were splattered all over the bridge. It made quite an impression on me." "I would imagine it did," said Sebastian, his mount moving restlessly beneath him as he studied an ancient stand of oak thickly undergrown with witch hazel that encroached close to the road here. Archie's eyes crinkled with a faint smile of remembrance. "For years I couldn't pass the bridge without looking to see if I could spot some trace of all those splattered brains. Somehow, I always managed to convince myself that I did." Archie's smile faded as he squinted up at the roiling clouds overhead. "You really think Seton's death could somehow be connected to what's happening now?" "The timing is interesting," said Sebastian. "Sybil Moss died on Midsummer's Eve in 1797. Less than 7 months later, Hannah Grant was found floating in the mill pond. And just 2 weeks after that, Lord Seton falls off his horse at one of the few places between the Blue Boar and home where he's guaranteed to do himself some serious damage. You don't find that suspicious?" "When you put it that way, yes. It's damnably suspicious." Sebastian said, "Do you know if there was an autopsy?" "I doubt it. My father was always ranting and raving about the parish rates. He wouldn't have paid to hold an inquest if it hadn't been required." "I gather the inquest's verdict was death by misadventure?" Archie nodded. "Seton's horse, a sweet-tempered white mare named Cleo, was declared a deodand. Liv Irving bought her, rode her for years." Under English common law, chattel found to have been involved in a death was known as a deodand and had to be forfeited, whether it was a horse, a cart, a boat, or tree. All deodands passed to the Crown and were usually sold, although owners could pay a fine equal to their value to keep their property. It was less common now than it had once been, but Sebastian wouldn't be surprised if Archie had had to pay to keep his father's hunter, Black Jack. For some reason, Lady Seton had evidently not chosen to do so. Archie's face had taken on a flat, empty look, as if his thoughts were suddenly far, far away. "What is it?" asked Sebastian, watching him. Archie swallowed. "If you're right, and I'm afraid you may very well be, then that's 3 murders me father missed. Sybil, Hannah,
and Lord Seton. 3! Sebastian was tempted to say, "There may have been more," but he kept that possibility to himself. "My God," said Archie, his voice rough. "Poor Hannah Grant was buried at the crossroads with a stake through her heart. Whoever is doing this is clever, and devious enough to make most of his murders look like suicides or accidents. Under the circumstances, your father's mistake was easy to make." Archie shook his head, his eyes narrowed and hard. "I want to find him. Whoever's doing this, I want to find him and hang him." Sebastian remained silent. He'd told Archie his suspicion that Leopold Seton's death might be linked to the other murders, but he'd yet to divulge the rest of his thinking. It was all still speculation, too unproven. He shifted his gaze to the crenellated sandstone gatehouse that guarded the entrance to Northcote Abbey's long, stately drive. The big house itself was out of sight, hidden by the heavy, late-summer canopy of the plantings that dotted the estate's rolling, expansive park. And he found himself thinking about the family that had lived here, carefully hiding their religious faith, generation after generation, on down through the centuries. What did that sort of pervasive, inescapable fear do to people, he wondered? What would it be like, living endlessly with that level of distrust and suspicion and duplicity, all while gazing down on the crumbling ruins of the priory from which your wealth had been seized? He said, "Was Lady Seton a Catholic before she married?" Archie looked puzzled, but answered readily enough. "She was, yes. I understand she's related to the Nevilles and Howards." Both were famous Catholic families who had managed to maintain their wealth and power despite their religion. "Why?" Sebastian shook his head. "Just wondering." Archie gathered his reins, then hesitated. "Have you ever not caught a killer?" "Not one I wanted to catch." "But what if we never figure out who's doing this?" "Then I suspect he'll eventually kill again," said Sebastian, and saw the colour drain from the young squire's face. Chapter 51. Hero was writing up some of her interview notes at the table in the private parlour when a timid knock sounded at the door. "Come in," she called, expecting Mary Beth, the chambermaid. The door opened to reveal a slight, white-haired old woman, her heavily lined face swollen and twisted with grief. "Begging your ladyship's pardon for disturbing you," said the woman, wringing her hands nervously before her. "McBroom, he told me to take myself off, so I nipped up the back stairs when he weren't looking." Hero paused with her quill still in her hand. "May I help you?" The woman bobbed an awkward curtsy. "I'm Becca Dickey, Reuben's mother." Hero rose to go to her. "I am so sorry for what happened to your son. Please come in and sit down." The widow Dickey's eyes widened. "Thank you kindly, milady, but it wouldn't be proper for me to sit. It wouldn't." "Nonsense, I insist." It took some work, but the old woman finally allowed herself to be coaxed to a seat beside the empty hearth, while Hero gave the bell a sharp tug and ordered a tray with tea and toast. "Did you have something you wished to tell Lord Devlin?" she asked, settling opposite the woman. "I'm afraid he's not here at the moment." The widow Dickey shook her head. "It was you I was wanting to see." She hesitated, then pushed on. "It's about me, Reuben. He wasn't supposed to go out after dark, you see. The old squire, he said he'd clap Reuben in the stocks every day for a week if the poor boy ever so much as stuck his nose out at night again. But Reuben, he never was real good at doing what he was told." Hero waited, and after a moment the old woman started up again, her voice hushed, ragged. "He was out the night that pretty lady was kilt. Come back real spooked, he did. Wouldn't tell me what had happened. But whatever it was, it scared him bad." Hero leaned forward in her chair. "You think he might have witnessed her murder?"
Reuben's mother plucked at the worn, stained cloth of her dress.
I dunno. To be honest, my lady, I have wondered, ever since they found her dead. You see, Reuben was scared, but he was also excited, the way he'd get when he'd had a secret. He did like his secrets.
If Reuben had seen Emma Chandler's murder, it would have been a dangerous secret to keep, thought Hero. It might very well have ended up getting the simple-minded man killed.
He'd gone out the night before, too,
Reuben's mother was saying.
Oh?
Silent tears began to slide unchecked down the old woman's cheeks.
Was out most the night, he was. Didn't come back till the sun was up, which was right foolish of him. So I told him, you can be sure of that.
Do you know where he would go at night?
She shook her head. He'd just wander. Sometimes he'd tell me things he'd seen, but not always.
Did he tell you what he saw Sunday night?
I know he was by the Pack Bridge at dawn, because he told me he'd come upon that lady down there, painting a picture she was.
Yes, said Hero.
Reuben told Lord Devlin he'd seen her there.
The widow Dicky nodded.
The thing is, my lady, I don't think Reuben told his lordship that was the second time he'd seen her that morning.
Hero found her attention well and truly caught. It was?
The old woman shifted uncomfortably in her chair, not quite willing to meet Hero's gaze. I don't like to be carrying tales, especially not about a man of God, but—
Yes?
The widow Dicky gripped the arms of her chair with gnarled, work-worn hands. The Reverend's got this cousin, you see. Rachel Timms is her name. She's a widow, she is. Her husband, he was killed in the war some years back. The vicar, he's got this little cottage tucked into the side of the hill just above the churchyard. Hill Cottage, it's called. The old sexton used to live there, but Nash, he's got his own cottage, so he don't need it. So when Mrs. Tim's husband was killed, and she had no place to go, the Reverend, he let her come and live at Hill Cottage.
That was very kind of him, said Hero, not quite certain where any of this was going.
He did the same for another cousin of his. Maybe 8 years ago it was. Rose Blount was her name.
Reuben's mother chewed on her lower lip.
Only she died after a few years.
Hero studied the older woman's age-lined, troubled face.
Mrs. Dicky,
what are you trying to tell me?
The old woman met her gaze squarely. Rose Blount died in childbirth, my lady. Her and the babe both. She never told nobody who her baby's father was. But thing is, from the first week the vicar brought her here, my Reuben, he was telling me how he'd see the vicar sneaking over there to her cottage in the middle of the night when there weren't nobody else around. And then, after she died, why, the vicar, he didn't let more'n a few months go past before he's got his cousin Rachel living in that cottage. And Reuben tells me the vicar is visiting her at night, too.
Hero felt her stomach tilt with revulsion. Are these women actually his cousins, do you think?
Oh, yes, my lady. I truly believe they are. Everybody thinks he's such a fine, generous man, letting them live in Hill Cottage for free. But there ain't nothing kind nor generous about it, and he ain't letting them live there for free, if you get my drift.
Do you think his wife knows what he does?
The widow Dicky snorted. How could she help but know? You ask me, she don't mind the way things are one bit, so long as it keeps him out of her bed.
How many people in town know about this?
As to that, I can't say. There may be some as suspects it, but ain't nobody going to talk about it, him being the vicar and all. I've argued with myself for days, thinking maybe I should tell somebody what me Reuben's seen. And now, me boy's dead, and I can't help but wonder if— She swallowed. Maybe if I'd spoke up sooner, Reuben would still be alive.
I don't exactly understand what this has to do with the death of Emma Chandler, said Hero.
But that's just it, me lady. The churchyard is the first place Reuben told me he'd seen the pretty lady early that morning, even before the sun come up. She'd walked up the hill from the Blue Boar and was standing by the lich gate when the Reverend left Rachel Timms's cottage.
Did Reverend Underwood see her?
How could he help but?
I mean, it ain't like she was trying to hide.
He walked right by her. Reuben said the Reverend mumbled something about a sick parishioner. So he's seen her, all right.
Did he see Reuben?
I don't rightly know. Hero watched Becca Dickey pluck at her skirts again. The woman hadn't come right out and said she suspected Benedict Underwood of having killed both her son and Emma Chandler, but the implications were obvious. "I've always felt right sorry for Mrs. Thames," Reuben's mother was saying, "just like I did for Rose Blount. A woman shouldn't have to turn herself into a whore for her own cousin, just to have a roof over her head."
"How do you know she's not willing?"
Becca Dickey stared at Hero with unblinking, wise eyes. "Talk to Rachel Timms. You'll see." Hill Cottage lay just to the north of the churchyard wall, tucked into a slight dip in the slope. Built of whitewashed fieldstone, with a roof of lichen-encrusted slate, it was small and doubtless dark inside, with its front shutters closed even at midday, as if against prying eyes. Once the cottage might have boasted a garden. Now there were only a few scraggly, half-dead rose bushes and some forlorn-looking poppies struggling to survive in a patch of dirt scratched nearly bare by a flock of dispirited-looking chickens. Hero rapped with one gloved fist on the worn door, then stood listening as the sound faded away into wind-blown silence. She waited, then knocked again. She could feel the other woman standing, breathless, wondering, afraid, on the other side of the door's weathered panels. "Mrs. Timms," said Hero softly, "are you there? I need to speak with you. It's about the young woman who was killed in the village last week." "Mrs. Timms?" Silence. "Blast," whispered Hero under her breath. She was turning away when the door was suddenly yanked open about a foot, and then stopped. A painfully thin woman appeared in the gap. She looked to be perhaps 10 years older than Hero, with a long oval face, and the sallow complexion of someone who'd once lived in a fiercely sunny climate, but now rarely ventured out of doors. Her pale blonde hair was already lightly touched by grey, and unfashionably secured in a tight roll at the nape of her neck. Her dove-grey gown was plain and threadbare, the hand gripping the edge of the door reddened and chapped by work. There was nothing about either her appearance or her manner to suggest the kind of woman who regularly received furtive midnight visits from a forbidden lover. "Good morning," said Hero. "I'm sorry for disturbing you. I'm Lady Devlin." "I know who you are," said Rachel Timms, her voice well-bred and cultured, but timid, breathy. "What makes you think I know anything about the woman who was killed? May I come in, please?" Rachel Timms's nostrils flared on a quickly drawn breath, her chest jerking as she struggled to choose between two equally frightening prospects: to risk being seen with Hero on her doorstep, or to invite her inside. And Hero found herself wondering if anyone besides Benedict Underwood had entered Hill Cottage since Rachel Timms's arrival here 5 or 6 years before. "It's important," said Hero. She thought for a moment that Rachel Timms meant to close the door in her face. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, quickly, please." Chapter 52. The Reverend Benedict Underwood was inspecting that year's crop of small, unripe apples in the ancient walled orchard beside the vicarage when Sebastian walked up the lane toward the church. Sebastian had just spent the last half-hour listening to Hero's account of her meeting with Rachel Timms, an experience that left him hard put to maintain his equanimity.
"Looks as if you should have a good harvest this year," he said.
his head tipping back as he surveyed the tree's gnarled, heavily laden branches. The vicar's face settled into his habitual benevolent half-smile.
Yes, God willing.
I'm sorry I was unable to attend yesterday's funeral, said Sebastian, looking out over the low wall that separated the orchard from the churchyard. Because this was the favoured south side, the weathered, lichen-covered gravestones were thick here. The vicar winced.
I heard about what happened to Reuben Dickey. Poor, wretched soul. He was always carving little wooden animals for the village children. Everything from sheep and horses to foxes and deer. He was amazingly talented at it.
I'd wondered what he did with them, said Sebastian, as the two men turned to walk between the rows of old fruit trees. Underwood glanced sideways at him.
Any idea who could possibly have done such a thing?
We have a few theories.
Oh?
It seems Reuben had a habit of wandering at night. The vicar nodded sadly.
I know. He wasn't supposed to, but...
He shrugged. It's very likely that he was killed because of something he saw. Underwood blinked and said again,
Oh?
Perhaps the night Emma Chance was killed, although his death could also be linked to something he saw late the previous night. Or, more accurately, something he saw early that morning.
You mean Monday morning?
Yes. Sebastian kept his gaze on the vicar's bland face. As it happens, he and Miss Chandler both saw you leaving Hill Cottage shortly before sunrise. Underwood bent to pick up an unripe apple that had fallen amongst the roots of the tree beside them. He tossed it up and down for a moment, as if considering his response. When he looked over at Sebastian, he had his faint, concerned smile firmly back in place.
I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about.
Indeed. Do you imagine your visits to Rachel Timms a secret?
They're not.
Oh, no doubt some of your parishioners think you a good, generous man for lending a hand to your indigent female relatives. It would probably never occur to them that their own vicar fathered the child whose birth killed Rose Blount.
I wonder, did your cousins know what they were letting themselves in for when they took up your seemingly generous offer to come live in your cottage? Somehow I doubt it.
But once they were here, you had them at your mercy, didn't you? The vicar's smile was still eerily in place, but his eyes were hard and glittering with righteous anger.
Are you somehow imagining Rachel unwilling? Believe me, you flatter her. She's a widow, not some silly, shrinking virgin. Rose was the same, eager enough to spread her legs in exchange for a roof over her head.
Sebastian thought about the desperate woman Hero had described to him, frightened, isolated, shattered and ashamed, betrayed by one she'd trusted. His hands curled into fists, and he had to force himself to unclench them. It still feels like rape, Rachel had told Hero, shoulders shaking with her quiet sobs. He's been doing it to me 3 nights a week for over 5 years now, and every time it still feels like rape. But it's not, you know. I've never fought him, never told him no. How can I? I've nowhere else to go. He's turned me into his whore, but I let him do it. There isn't a day goes by I don't think of killing myself. But my father was a vicar too. I understand that God has sent this trial to me, and the penance for my weakness and sin is that I must endure it. To which Hero had replied, "Have you thought about killing him?" Rachel's gaze flew to meet Hero's. Then she looked away and gave a quick, jerky nod. God help me, I have, yes. But even if I did somehow escape hanging for it, Ayleswick would then have a new vicar. So I would lose Hill Cottage anyway. And burn in hell for all eternity for what I've done. Now a small rabbit showed its head amongst the tall grass at the edge of the orchard, and Underwood chucked the green apple at it. The rabbit disappeared. Sebastian said, "In a little over a week, 3 people have been murdered in Ayleswick, and you had a motive to kill at least 2 of them." Underwood swung to face him,
his mouth sagging open.
You can't be serious.
Oh, but I am. You see, we now know why Emma Chandler was here in Ayleswick. It had nothing to do with a sketching expedition, and everything to do with discovering who, out of a list of 7 men, raped her mother 22 years ago. Your name was on her list.
Are you mad?
And we now know you're the kind of man who has no qualms about forcing himself on unwilling women, all of which leads to the obvious conclusion that Emma somehow discovered you were her father, and you killed her to shut her up. You killed her, and then you staged her death to look like a suicide, complete with a poetic verse cut from your own bloody copy of Hamlet tucked into her dead hand.
Don't be preposterous. Why would I then leave my book lying around where it could be found?
I don't know that you did. It's possible you thought you'd hidden the book, or disposed of it in some way. Only Reuben Dickey found it, probably because he saw you hide it. That's why you killed him, because you were afraid of what else he might have seen. The vicar stared at him, chest jerking with the agitation of his breathing, his jaw set hard.
But this is ridiculous, utterly ridiculous.
Sebastian said, I also wouldn't be surprised if you killed Sybil Moss all those years ago as well, either because you were worried your parishioners might find out you'd fathered the child she was carrying, or because she refused your unwelcome advances, and you were afraid she might tell someone about how you tried to force yourself on her. Her and Hannah Grant both.
Good God! What sort of a monster do you take me for?
Rather than answer, Sebastian found his gaze drifting down to the picturesque, deceptively peaceful-looking village curled around the base of the hill. The wind was scuttling the clouds overhead in a way that sent shifting patterns of shadow and light chasing each other across the broad green and the ancient half-timbered buildings that edged it. 15 years before, the Reverend had successfully convinced a coroner's jury that Sybil Moss hadn't been in her right mind when she supposedly killed herself. Had it been a gesture of disinterested kindness or of guilt? He'd been unable to do the same for Hannah Grant.
You're wrong, said Underwood. You hear me? You're wrong.
Sebastian brought his gaze back to the pale, sweat-slicked face of the man beside him. If you killed Emma Chandler and the others, I will see you hang for it. Make no mistake about that. Underwood was shaking now, an odour of sour sweat rising from his cassock.
But I didn't. I swear to God that I didn't kill her. I didn't kill any of them.
Then I suggest you pray to him for salvation, if you have any reason to believe he'll listen to you, said Sebastian, and turned to walk off, and leave him there, standing rigid and unmoving in the tall, drying grass of the old orchard. Chapter 53. For any man, let alone a man of God, to take advantage of his impoverished female relative's vulnerability to satisfy his lust was as despicable as it was repellent. There was no doubt that Benedict Underwood was a vile human being who conceivably had a motive to kill everyone from Sybil Moss to Reuben Dickey. But that didn't necessarily make him guilty. What it did was explain why a killer would use Underwood's edition of Hamlet and why he wouldn't destroy the book after cutting it up. Given Underwood's rape of Rachel Timms and Rose Blount, there was little doubt that those 4 simple words, sliced from the vicar's book, "The rest is silence," would be enough to see the Reverend hanged should he ever go on trial for Emma's murder. But for some reason he couldn't have explained, Sebastian still wasn't convinced, and the nagging certainty that he was still missing something drove him back to the private parlour at the Blue Boar. Opening Emma Chandler's 2 sketchbooks on the room's large central table, he stood staring down at them, his fingers curling around the table's edge. He kept coming back to the idea that the key to what had happened to Emma Chandler lay in the pattern of her movements on that last fatal day. And as he turned the pages of her sketchbook for what must have been the 100th time, he realized It wasn't just one thing he'd been missing, but two. Half an hour later, he was still staring at Emma's last sketch when Hero came in from taking Simon for a walk. She brought with her the scent of fresh country breezes and sun-warmed ripe grain, and paused in the doorway to watch him in silence for a moment. "You figured something out?" she said.
"I have indeed."
He spun the sketchbook, with the drawings of the Priory, around to face her.
"I don't know why I didn't grasp the significance of it before, but think about this. Unless Emma's killer took off her gloves for some inexplicable reason, then she must not have been wearing them when she was killed. So what does that tell us?"
When visiting, a gentlewoman generally removed her gloves only to eat. But according to Hiram Higginbottom, Emma had been killed several hours after her last meal. Hero looked puzzled for a moment. Then enlightenment dawned. She would have to take off her gloves to sketch. That means she was killed while she was drawing something. But what?
"Whatever it was," said Sebastian, "she obviously never had a chance to actually begin sketching it. Nothing has been torn out, and the last drawing in her book is of the Priory, and it looks finished to me."
You think she really did go back to draw Mablethorpe Hall again for some reason, and the smugglers killed her?
That's what I was thinking at first. Except...
He broke off to flip back through the sketchbook.
"Look at this. She drew 6 pictures of the Grange, 5 of Northcote Abbey, but only 3 of St. Hilary's Priory. Why?"
Hero came to stand at his side. Perhaps she was more interested in the Grange and Northcote Abbey, because either of them might have been her father's home, whereas the Priory was simply an attractive ruin.
Perhaps. Except I remember thinking, when we were at the ruin, what a beautiful, inspiring sight someone with her talents must have found it. She'd already drawn one of these 3 pictures by the time Lady Seaton claims to have seen her at 2 o'clock. Yet according to the miller's wife, Emma didn't leave the Priory and climb back over the stile until 5. In other words, it took her 3 hours to do the last 2 sketches.
Hero began turning the pages of the book.
He said, "How long do you think one of these sketches would take?"
If they were detailed renderings, she could have spent days on one. But they're not. They're just quick, loose impressions. And if she did 6 similar sketches of the Grange, plus a portrait of Squire Rawlins, in one morning, then surely she didn't spend an hour and a half on each of these last 2 drawings. Hero raised her gaze to his. "What are you suggesting, Devlin?"
"One of 3 things. Either she went someplace else after she left the Priory, but before she climbed over that stile at 5 o'clock.
Someplace like Northcote Abbey, you mean? A second visit no one has told us about?" He nodded.
"Either that, or the miller's wife was wrong about when she saw Emma climb over the stile."
I was under the impression Alice Gibbs was quite certain about the time.
She was, and we all simply accepted her testimony without question. But she could have been wrong. It's even conceivable that for some reason I can't begin to imagine, she's lying."
Hero untied the ribbon of her hat and pulled it off. "You said there's a third possibility." His gaze met hers.
"The third possibility is that the miller's wife didn't see Emma that afternoon at all, because Emma never left the Priory alive. In other words, she died there."
Alice Gibbs was hoeing a row of beets when Sebastian turned his curricle into the short lane that led to the neat stone cottage beside the mill. She straightened slowly, one hand self-consciously smoothing her skirts as she watched him hop down from the carriage's high seat.
"My lord," she said, bobbing a curtsy, "if it's Miller Gibbs you're looking for, I'm afraid he's gone off to see the smith about getting a shaft fixed."
"Actually," said Sebastian, "you're the one I came to see, Mrs. Gibbs. I wanted to ask you about the evening you saw Emma Chandler, or Chance, as she called herself. I understand you were out in your garden?"
"Yes, my lord. Picking some radishes I was, when Mr. Flanagan stopped by to talk about our Henry."
The miller's wife beamed with maternal pride.
"Doing ever so well with these studies, is our Henry?"
"That must make you very pleased."
Her smile widened.
"It does, yes, ever so much, me lord. Never learned to read or write myself, you see, so I can't tell you what it means to me, seeing my boy catching on so quick."
Sebastian turned to glance up the narrow, leafy lane toward the coach road, a distance of some 200 or 300 feet away. He himself could have identified someone at many times that distance, but then his vision was uncommonly acute.
"You must have very good eyesight," he said.
Alice Gibbs laughed, her face rosy and full-cheeked.
"Me? Oh, no, me lord. Anybody in town can tell you I wouldn't recognise me own husband if I was on one side of the church and he was on the other. I wouldn't have known it was Mrs. Chance at all if Mr. Flanagan hadn't told me."
"Oh," said Sebastian, still smiling pleasantly. "What did he say?"
She thought about it a moment.
"I reckon he said something like, 'There goes that widow what's been drawing all the old buildings hereabouts. She must have been sketching the Priory.' And I said, 'She picked a lovely day for it.' And we talked a bit about the nice spell of weather we'd been having."
"And then what?"
If she found the question odd, she didn't show it.
"Well, he'd just been telling me how he had a meeting at 5:30, so then he said he'd best be hurrying along."
It was a detail Sebastian had heard before, but he hadn't paid any attention to it. Now it struck him as blindingly significant, as if Flanagan had gone out of his way to make certain the miller's wife remembered the time. She was still smiling broadly, eager to be of assistance and proud of her ability to tell him what he wanted to know. He said,
"The village is lucky to have Mr. Flanagan. Oh, aren't we just? He's ever such a kind, scholarly man."
"Exactly how long has he been here?"
"Well, let's see. Must be more'n 2 years now. He come right after poor old Mr. Coombs passed away."
"Mr. Coombs was the previous schoolmaster?"
"He was, yes, my lord."
"And he died 2 summers ago?"
"More like that February or March it was."
In other words, thought Sebastian, just months after Lucien Bonaparte was sent to Shropshire. Aloud he said,
"How did he die?"
"Something hit his stomach, it did."
Sebastian found himself wondering if what hit the unfortunate Mr. Coombs' stomach had been poison. Someone had obviously been making Ayleswick-on-Teme an extraordinarily unhealthy place to live for quite some time now. He bowed his head and touched his hand to his hat.
"Thank you for your assistance, Mrs. Gibbs. You've been most helpful."
"Any time, my lord, any time."
He'd almost reached the curricle when a thought occurred to him, and he paused to turn back and ask,
"Could you see Miss Chandler well enough to tell what she was wearing?"
Alice Gibbs laughed as she reached down to pick up the hose she'd dropped.
"I could see that, my lord. Had on a light grey cloak, she did."
There'd been a grey cloak hanging on one of the hooks in Emma's room at the Blue Boar, but she hadn't had it with her when she was found. She hadn't even been wearing her spencer, which was folded up beside her.
Bit warm for a cloak, wouldn't you say? It was indeed. I remember thinking she must have put it on that morning, worrying maybe it was going to come on to rain again.
"That must be it," said Sebastian.
She smiled at him again, totally oblivious to the fact that she hadn't actually seen anything she claimed to have personally witnessed. Chapter 54. Sebastian found the front door and windows of the schoolmaster's cottage standing open to catch whatever breeze might chance to stir the close air of the sultry afternoon.
"Mr. Flanagan?"
He paused on the flagged stoop, his gaze drifting over the vaguely untidy, low-ceilinged front room, the massive bookcase stuffed with an assortment of tattered volumes, the battered, ink-stained table that looked ancient enough to have once graced the stately halls of the old priory.
"Mr. Flanagan?" he called again.
Through a doorway in the room's rear wall, he could see a section of the smoke-blackened kitchen hearth. A steep staircase to one side presumably led to a dormered steeping chamber above. But the silence in the cottage was absolute.
"Flanagan!"
Sebastian hesitated, then walked around the outside of the cottage to the cobblestoned yard at the rear. In addition to the woodshed and other typical outbuildings, he was surprised to find a small but relatively new barn and fenced paddock. A neat black mare with powerful hindquarters and a deep chest thrust her head over the fence and whinnied at him expectantly.
"Aren't you a fine girl?"
said Sebastian, going to stroke the mare's muzzle. There weren't many schoolmasters who could afford to keep such an elegant mount. True, Flanagan had neither wife nor children to feed, and he'd reportedly been riding through Ayleswick on his way to Wales when he learned of the recently vacated position of village schoolmaster. But a different explanation for the mare's presence was forming in Sebastian's mind. A man carrying messages, first to Ludlow, then to Worcestershire, would need a good, reliable horse. The mare butted her head against his chest. He said,
"Where's your master,
With growing disquiet, Sebastian gave the mare a final pat and turned toward the open door of the hay barn. Stepping into the darkened interior, he listened to the telltale drone of flies, smelled the coppery stench of spilled blood. And then, when his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he found what was left of Darragh Flanagan.
"Maybe we're making a mistake trying to make sense of all this,"
said Archie, his voice oddly hollow-sounding as he stared down at the schoolmaster's sprawled, bloody body. The flies were buzzing thick around them, but the squire was making no attempt to bat them away from his face.
"Whoever this killer is, he must simply be mad."
Like Reuben Dickey, Flanagan lay face down, the back of his head a pulpy mess. A bloodied length of firewood lay discarded nearby. Sebastian studied the marks on the barn's dirt floor. From the looks of things, the Irishman had been struck elsewhere, probably in the cobbled yard, and dragged into the barn.
"I don't think so,"
said Sebastian, going to stand in the barn's open doorway.
"I think whoever's doing this has a very deliberate, rational purpose for everything he's done."
Archie stayed where he was.
"How'd you happen to come here anyway?" "I had an interesting conversation this afternoon with Alice Gibbs. She tells me she's myopic. Famously so, in fact." "She is, yes."
Archie gave a hoarse laugh.
"I remember one time she thought a billy goat menacing a couple of my father's dogs was her own daughter, Elizabeth."
Sebastian narrowed his eyes against the light as he searched the yard for traces of blood.
"So how do you suppose she was able to recognize Emma Chandler from a distance of 200 or 300 feet?
Archie opened his mouth, took a deep breath, and closed it.
"I don't know. I didn't think about that."
"She tells me it was actually Flanagan who identified the figure climbing over the stile that afternoon as Emma. Alice simply saw what she'd been led to believe she was seeing."
"But what difference does it make if it was Flanagan or Alice Gibbs who saw Emma?"
"Because I don't think the person they watched was actually Emma. According to Alice Gibbs, the figure she saw climbing over the stile was wearing a grey cloak. Now, it's possible that at some point before Emma was killed, she went back to the Blue Boar and left the cloak in her room. But I doubt it. I think she was killed before 5 o'clock, and it was all just an elaborate ruse to disguise the actual time and place of her death."
"But why? Why was it so important to cover up when and where she died?"
"It would be of vital importance if she was killed because she'd accidentally stumbled upon a meeting between Lucien Bonaparte and someone delivering a message from France." Archie stared at him.
"You can't be serious."
"I wish I weren't." A dark smear on the cobbles near the woodshed caught Sebastian's attention, and he went to have a closer look.
"Is that blood?"
asked Archie, watching him.
"It is.
From the looks of things, I say Flanagan was killed here.
then dragged into the barn out of sight, probably either late last night or early this morning. The blood had long since dried. Hopefully Higginbottom will be able to give us a better idea. That is, if he ever gets around to it. The last they'd heard, the old doctor had yet to begin the post-mortem on Reuben Dickey, despite the inquest scheduled for that Thursday. He said his cow was still sick. Archie watched Sebastian push to his feet. But how do you know Flanagan didn't simply think he saw Emma and got it wrong? I mean, how do you know he was deliberately misleading Alice Gibbs? Because he's dead. Oh. Archie went to sit on the mounting block in the corner of the yard, his head in his hands. He sat there for a long time. Then he dropped his hands and lifted his head to stare at Sebastian. So, who was in the grey cloak? The killer, said Sebastian, and he's just eliminated his accomplice. Sebastian had no doubt that whoever killed Flanagan was clever enough to have removed anything from the dead schoolmaster's cottage that might implicate him. But they searched the cottage anyway. Even clever people make mistakes. Slowly and methodically, they went through every drawer and cupboard, checked each room for loose floorboards or chimney bricks, inspected the undersides and backs of each piece of furniture. As they searched, Sebastian told Archie of the previous day's encounter at Mablethorpe's carriage house. I gave Weston my word as a gentleman I wouldn't report him to the authorities unless I had reason to believe his smuggling operation had something to do with Emma Chandler's death. But now I do. Archie looked up from searching the contents of a pantry shelf. You think Weston is the killer? He could be, although I doubt it. In all likelihood, he's just a greedy bastard taking advantage of the war to run contraband. He probably has no idea the French have been using his smuggling line to pass messages back and forth between Napoleon and his brother. Through Flanagan? He arrived shortly after Bonaparte was sent to Shropshire, didn't he? March of 1811? He did, yes. But why would Paris send someone to Ayleswick then? I mean, yes, Lucien is here this summer, but 2 years ago he was in Ludlow. And after that, he moved to his estate in Worcestershire. Sebastian shifted his search to the front room. How often would Flanagan go out of town? Fairly often, admitted Archie, hunkering down to peer beneath the desk. He has a cousin keeps a tavern near Warwick. He used to... He broke off when he realised what he was saying and muttered, bloody hell. After that, he worked in silence for some minutes, obviously turning the information over in his head. Then he said, What I don't understand is, if Flanagan was the one delivering the messages, then who's the killer? Sebastian pushed a chest back into place. I don't know. Lucien Bonaparte must know, said Archie, standing in the centre of the front room, his hands dangling loosely at his sides. Damn that bloody French bastard all to hell. He not only knows who's doing this, he was probably there when Emma was killed. Perhaps, but I doubt it. Sebastian went to scan the titles in the sagging old bookcase. In all likelihood, Bonaparte only dealt with Flanagan. It's probably another reason Flanagan was brought in, to help protect the identity of whatever agent was already in place. I wouldn't be surprised if Napoleon is more than a bit suspicious of his brother's loyalties. You're saying the French have someone else here in Ayleswick? My God, who? Rather than answer, Sebastian reached for a volume of 18th-century Scottish sermons and opened the flyleaf to a scrawled, nearly illegible signature, Alistair Coombs. He looked up. These books belong to the village's previous schoolmaster? Archie nodded. Most everything you see here was his. He had no heirs that we knew of, so we just left it all for Flanagan. He was happy enough to have it. Sebastian closed the book and slipped it back into place before pulling out another, then another. What are you looking for? Asked Archie, watching him. Sebastian opened a volume of John Donne's poetry and turned the flyleaf to face the young squire. "Well, I'll be," whispered Archie, as he stared down at the familiar signature written in a tight, cramped hand. The Reverend Benedict Ainsley Underwood. Chapter 55. In the end, they found nearly half a dozen books from the vicar's library, tucked in amongst those left by Alistair Coombs. "What the devil!" swore Archie, as Sebastian opened yet another of the vicar's volumes. "I want Underwood clapped in irons! The sanctimonious, traitorous, murdering bastard!" Sebastian calmly set the volume aside. "A moment ago you were convinced the killer was Major Weston." Archie stared at him, his breath coming hard and fast enough to visibly jerk his chest. "You're saying you don't think Underwood is the killer? But his books are here." Sebastian studied the titles of the small stack of volumes. Old Alistair Coombs' reading tastes had run mainly to histories and sermons, but the books borrowed from the vicar's library were all poetry. Think about this. Why would Underwood go through the trouble of killing Flanagan, yet not bother to remove his books from Flanagan's shelves? Maybe he forgot they were here. Or maybe he was interrupted before he had the chance to gather them up. Perhaps. By all means, I think you should ask the good Reverend for an explanation. Archie went to stand in the open doorway, his hands on his hips, as he watched Constable Nash and one of the cottagers load Darragh Flanagan's body into a cart. "When is this killing going to end?" he said after a moment, his voice less angry now, more shaken. "When anyone who could possibly identify the killer is dead." Archie turned to meet Sebastian's eyes, resignation mingling with a wild look of lost innocence in the young squire's eyes. While Archie stormed off to confront the vicar, Sebastian quietly called for his curricle and drove out to the Dower House. Except he didn't expect to find Major Eugene Weston there. There were times when one simple piece of evidence, read wrong, could throw a murder investigation entirely off course. In this case, that bit of evidence was a short line of poetry from an Elizabethan play. "The rest is silence." Those 4 words, tucked into Emma Chandler's dead hand, had suggested a killer who was not simply literate, but erudite. A killer who, in casting about in his mind for one more clue that might point to suicide, was educated and well read enough to come up with a Shakespearean quote. That, combined with the revelation of Emma's search for the gentleman who'd raped her mother, had inevitably led Sebastian to focus on a narrow segment of the parish's residents. He wondered why it hadn't occurred to him before that there might be more than one killer at work here. Was it simply too difficult to believe that this small, seemingly peaceful village harboured not one, but 2 murderers, even though he already knew its bucolic atmosphere to be deceptive? Was it really that simple? 2 killers. One, a new arrival to Ayleswick, educated, and so fond of poetry that he occasionally helped himself to volumes from the vicar's library. And the other... who? Virtually any one of the district's better sort could conceivably be involved with Major Weston in his smuggling venture, and each could likewise have had a reason to kill Sybil Moss and Hannah Grant all those years ago. But the death of Darragh Flanagan opened up an entirely new possibility, one Sebastian pondered as he drove through fields ripe with golden grain. Because if it was Flanagan who had tucked that Shakespearean quote into Emma Chandler's hand, then the field of other suspects had just been thrown wide open. There was no need for the second killer to be literary. He need not even be literate. It was a realization that produced a significant shift in how Sebastian viewed everything he'd learned that past week. It forced him to re-evaluate every assumption he'd made and each conclusion he'd reached. And when he stepped back from all he thought he understood and looked at the village and its troubled history again with fresh eyes, a different pattern emerged. A pattern that was as compelling as it was profoundly, personally troubling. Liv Weston was pruning an overgrown hedge of roses at the base of her garden when Sebastian turned his chestnuts into the dower house's narrow, weed-choked drive. Looking up, she paused with one heavily gloved hand clutching her secateurs, her eyes narrowing as she watched him rein in before the house's modest portico. A large battered basket rested on the turf at her feet. As Sebastian dropped from the high seat to the gravel sweep, she deliberately turned her back on him and resumed shaping her hedge. Without bothering to mount the steps and knock on the front door, he turned and walked toward her. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Weston," he called. "Is the Major around?" She kept her gaze on her work. "I'm afraid not, my lord." "Any idea where I might find him?" "Sorry, no. As it happens, I haven't seen him since yesterday." Sebastian drew up beside the lanky hedge. It should by rights have been cut back weeks ago, shortly after it had finished blooming. "Did he say when he would be home?" Snip, snip went Liv Weston's secateurs. "Actually, we expected him for dinner last night. Mrs. Carmichael made braised pork. Always one of his favourites." Sebastian studied her half-averted face and saw there the faintest hint of a smile, a bubble of what might have been called suppressed hope if it hadn't had such a nasty edge to it. "You're not concerned?" "Not really." He became aware of the almost unnatural silence around them, broken only by a single thrush chattering in the branches of a nearby maple. Despite the cloud cover, the heat of the day had become oppressively close and still. He said, "Has something happened to your husband, Mrs. Weston?" "I've no idea, but a woman can dream, can't she?" She paused to glance over at him. "Does that shock you? You think I should feign concern? Truly? After you've spent the last week poking into all our lives, uncovering all our secrets?" "Not quite all of them, I'm afraid." "I think you underestimate yourself, my lord." Sebastian watched her cut off a long cane with a quick snip. Until that moment, he'd had sympathy for this woman, or at least for the young and vulnerable girl he imagined she'd once been. Now he began to wonder if some of that sympathy hadn't been misplaced. He said, "How long has your husband been dabbling in smuggling?" Her attention was all for her roses. "I'm a woman. What would I know of such things?" "You know." When she remained silent, he said, "Tell me this, Mrs. Weston. Why does your husband take such care to preserve the old gibbet that stands near the crossroads?" Her hand momentarily faltered at its task. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious." She shrugged. "He would tell you that gallows and gibbets, like whipping posts and stocks, play an invaluable role in reminding the lower orders of the folly of forgetting their proper place in the scheme of things. But the truth is, my husband is a nasty, vindictive man. He hated Alex Dalrymple with the kind of passion not even death can satisfy, and he maintains that gibbet as a testament to what he sees as his victory over an enemy. If my husband had had his way, Dalrymple's body would still be mouldering up there." "Why? Because Dalrymple dared to oppose your father's bill of enclosure?" "In part, but mainly because Dalrymple was nothing more than a base-born self-taught wheelwright. Yet he was 10 times the man Eugene Weston could ever hope to be. And Eugene knows it." Sebastian watched her step back to evaluate her work. He wondered when she had realized the folly of her marriage. Before her father's death, obviously, given that she had successfully persuaded the enfeebled old man to tie up her inheritance in a way that kept what was left of it from Weston's grasp. Was that truly when Weston had turned to smuggling, he wondered? Or had it started before? Perhaps even before the erection of that tar-blackened gibbet at the crossroads. Sebastian touched his hat with a slight bow. "When your husband returns, if you would be so kind as to tell him I'd like to speak with him." "Of course.
said the Major's wife, that eerie little smile still curling her lips. "If he returns."
"You think the Major done run off after killing all them people?"
asked Tom when Sebastian returned to the curricle. Sebastian craned around to stare at his tiger.
How did you know Weston is missing?
"Heard the cook talk about it with the groom. They can't think why else he ain't come home."
Sebastian could think of another very good reason for Major Weston to have disappeared, but he kept that possibility to himself as he drove back to the village. "See the chestnuts taken care of," he told Tom, as they drew up before the Blue Boar. "Then I want you to find Squire Rawlins and suggest that it might be a good idea to send his constable out to nose around Maplethorpe's carriage house." The boy scrambled to take the reins, his sun-reddened face sharpening with sudden understanding.
"Holy hell! You think the Major might be dead?"
"His wife certainly thinks it."
"Holy hell," said Tom again. "What'll I tell the Squire if he asks where you've gone?"
Tell him I've gone for a walk." Chapter 56. Sebastian had just passed the outskirts of the village when Lucien Bonaparte came thundering toward him, mounted on a magnificent dapple-grey Arabian. "My lord," said Napoleon's brother, the grey sidling and tossing its head as he reined in hard beside Sebastian. "I was coming to see you." "Oh?" Sebastian kept walking. He was in no mood to deal with the Emperor's spoiled, self-indulgent brother.
"Is it true what they're saying? That Darré Flanagan is dead?"
Sebastian glanced up at the Corsican's pale, slack face. "Why? Are you admitting you knew him?"
"So it is true. He is dead. Mon Dieu, this is dreadful."
"It's certainly dreadful for Flanagan." The Corsican kicked his feet from the stirrups and dropped awkwardly to the ground.
"There is something I must tell you,"
he said, tugging at his rucked-up waistcoat as he fell into step beside Sebastian.
"Yes?" "I fear I was not quite truthful when I said I am not in contact with Paris. Not with Napoleon, you understand, but with my mother."
"I'd already figured that." Bonaparte's jaw sagged.
"You had?"
"I take it Flanagan was sent here as a courier?"
"He was, yes, but how did you know?"
"Call it a good guess. You met with him on Monday, at the Priory?" The Corsican nodded miserably.
"At 3 o'clock.
Sebastian drew up abruptly and swung to face him. "Who was with him?" Whatever Bonaparte saw in Sebastian's face caused him to take a quick step back.
"No one."
"You're certain?"
"Yes."
"Who arrived at the Priory first, you or Flanagan?"
"Flanagan."
"So he was waiting there for you?"
"He was, yes."
Bonaparte looked puzzled.
"That's important. Why?"
Sebastian said, "And you saw no sign there of Emma Chandler?"
"No, nothing. And now Flanagan is dead. And I've just learned that young woman was at the Priory that afternoon as well, and—"
"You didn't know that?"
"That she was there? No. Not until just now, when I heard Lady Seaton discussing it with her steward."
Emma's presence at the Priory that afternoon was known by everyone who had attended Emma's inquest. But then Lucien Bonaparte hadn't been present at the inquest. He'd sent his son in the company of Lady Seaton and Samuel Atwater. Bonaparte sucked in a quick, nervous breath.
"Is it someone sent by Whitehall who's doing this? I know that man, Annabel Pierce, was their creature."
"How do you know that?"
"Flanagan warned me. I wondered why he always insisted on passing me the packets from Paris in broad daylight rather than under cover of darkness. But he said anyone I met at night would immediately be suspect, whereas we might briefly encounter each other during the day without attracting undue attention."
"Did you order Pierce killed?"
"No, I've never ordered anyone killed. I don't kill people. I've never killed anyone, never." The message from Paris. What was it? I can't tell you that. Sebastian suppressed the urge to grasp the Corsican by the lapels of his coat and shake him. Bloody hell! At least 4 people are dead because of that message, if not 6. You don't know that. You know it too. It's why you're here. Napoleon's brother brought up 2 shaky hands to swipe them down over his face. My mother wrote to say that if the armies of this new alliance continue to march against us, France will surely fall. Even the world's most brilliant general needs an army, and there simply aren't enough men between the ages of 14 and 60 left to defend our borders. She wants to know if London would be agreeable to Napoleon abdicating in favor of his infant son, the King of Rome. I could answer that question for her. Lucien nodded sadly. I fear the time for such an action has passed. But I have sent out feelers to Castlereagh. Sebastian understood why Lucien had been reluctant to divulge the contents of his mother's message. It was one thing for malcontents on the streets of Paris to whisper about Napoleon abdicating in favor of his son, but it was something else entirely for the Emperor to actually be considering it. The other French agent here in Ayleswick, said Sebastian. Who is it? It was a question he was afraid he already knew the answer to, but he found he was still hoping to be proven wrong. Lucien Bonaparte chewed the inside of one cheek and gave Sebastian a glassy stare. God damn it, who is it? I don't know. Flanagan always called him our friend, but I never learned his identity. It's the way these things are structured. You must know that. The messages are sent in a sealed packet from Paris to the ship. Then once the ship arrives off your shore, the packet is handed to whoever is in charge of the horses that collect the cargo from the beach. They carry it here to Ayleswick. And give it to whom? Weston? Pfft. Bonaparte pushed a derisive breath out between his front teeth. The man is an idiot, content to pocket a few dollars here and there. Who would trust him? So who? Who took delivery of the packets and passed them to Flanagan to carry to you? He's the man who's actually been running Weston's little smuggling operation from the very beginning, isn't he? From long before you were sent to Shropshire. I don't know who he is. You must believe me. Why the bloody hell should I? Because it's the truth. Bonaparte's horse began to sidle, and he tightened his grip on its reins. I don't understand the reason for all this killing. Why is it happening? Because Emma Chandler was at the Priory sketching when Darragh Flanagan and the man you call your friend arrived. She must have accidentally seen or heard something that betrayed their links to Paris, and they killed her for it. But Flanagan's friend wasn't there. Just because you didn't see him doesn't mean he wasn't there. You say Flanagan knew about Hannibal Pierce. If that's true, his friend probably came along that day for the sake of security. And you're saying this man has now killed Flanagan? But why? Because he's afraid of being exposed. Flanagan was expendable, but his friend isn't. Another courier can always be brought in. But all this killing, it's too much, too much. You're certain you don't know who he is? No. Then you'd best hope he believes that. Lucien Bonaparte gave him a strange look. Why? Because I wouldn't put it past him to kill you too. Me? Why not? The Corsican opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. Sebastian said, Still certain you don't know who he is? Lucien Bonaparte gave a short, jerky shake of his head, his forehead beaded with sweat, his lips twitching with fear. And in spite of himself, Sebastian believed the man.
Chapter 57. The hollow twunk of an axe slicing into wood echoed in the sultry stillness of the afternoon as Sebastian approached the small stream that led to the old priory. He followed the sound around the side of Hetty Kincaid's cottage, to a dirt yard where Jenny Dalrymple was chopping lengths of wood into kindling. Her face was flushed and sheened with sweat, and she threw him a quick glance over one shoulder before reaching for another section of wood to rest on the block before her. He came to a halt some distance from her.
"Tell me about your cousin, Sybil Moss."
Jenny swung her axe, and the wood on the block shattered.
"What about her? Do you know the name of the gentleman she was seeing at the time she died? The one who put a babe in her belly?"
"Course I know it."
"Tell me about him."
She reached for another length of wood, but simply held it, her gaze on his face.
"You really want to hear it?"
The words were like a challenge thrown at him.
"Yes."
She set the section of wood on the block and swung again, splitting it neatly, the lean muscles in her shoulders and arms working beneath the thin cloth of her dress. Then she turned to face him, her breath coming hard and quick from her exertion.
"All right, I'll tell you then. It was Leopold Seton, the present Lord Seton's father."
Sebastian searched her tightly held, sweat-sheened features, looking for some sign of calculation or deception. But he found only contempt and an old anger.
He said,
"Is it possible Lord Seton killed her?"
For a long moment, Sebastian didn't think she meant to answer him. Then she set her jaw and shook her head.
"No, not in the way you mean."
"What about Lady Seton? Could she have done it?"
Jenny tilted her head to one side.
"Why you care how Sybil died?"
"Because I don't believe she threw herself off the cliffs of Northcote Gorge, just as I don't believe Hannah Grant drowned herself in the mill pond. Or Leopold Seton simply fell off his horse coming home drunk one night from the Blue Boar. I think they were murdered. And I think whoever killed them is now responsible for the death of Emma Chandler, and of all the other killings that have followed on from it."
Jenny swung her axe to sink the blade deep into the chopping block beside her.
"You're wrong.
Sybil did throw herself off the cliffs of Northcote Gorge."
"How can you be so certain?"
She swiped her sweaty face with the sleeve of one crooked elbow.
"Because I was there."
"At the gorge?"
Jenny lowered her arm, her hands dangling loose at her sides as she silently stared back at him.
He said, "Tell me what happened."
She continued to stare at him, and there was something about her face in that moment that reminded him so much of the last time he'd seen Jamie Knox that it tore at his gut.
"Why?"
she said at last. And he thought, because I don't want to believe that the man who was like a brother to Jamie is a killer, although I am very, very afraid that he is. But all he said was,
"It's important."
She twitched one shoulder. Sybil never made any secret of the fact she was lying with his lordship. Had been for months. She was so pretty. No one was surprised when she caught his eye. He went after all the pretty girls. Sebastian studied the flaring line of Jenny's cheekbones, the gentle curve of her lips. She was still an extraordinarily attractive woman, and he found himself wondering if she herself had once attracted Leopold Seton's attentions. If so, Seton must have quickly realized that this woman was far too dangerous to trifle with. She drew a painful breath. But Sybil, somehow she convinced herself things were different with her. She was so excited when she realized she was carrying his child. She thought, once he knew, he'd set her up in a fine house in Ludlow, with servants and a carriage and fancy clothes and jewels. I tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen to me. Said I was jealous and didn't want her to be happy.
So what happened?
She told him about the baby on Midsummer's Eve. during the bonfires.
At first he just laughed at her for thinking he'd acknowledge one of his bastards. But she didn't take it well. So then he flew into a rage. Told her if she tried to claim he'd fathered her brat, he'd have her taken up for being a whore and whipped through the village at the cart's tail.
Jenny swiped at her forehead again. He was like that. He could be smiling and oh, so handsome one minute, and then just like that, she snapped her fingers, he'd turn mean and ugly. In the end, he pushed her away from him hard enough to send her sprawling. Then he just walked off and left her there on the ground. She fell silent. Sebastian held himself very still, waiting for her to continue. She said, I went to help her up, put my arms around her and told her everything was going to be all right. But she wouldn't stop crying. She was talking wild about what a fool she'd been and how she just wanted to die, that she ought to go throw herself off Monk's head. Then she pulled away from me and ran off into the night. He could picture the scene all too well, the hellish glow from the bonfires lighting up the darkness and reflecting on the young girl's tears, the warm night air heavy with herb-scented smoke, the laughter and excitement of villagers drunk on cider, and a primitive tradition older than anyone knew. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "What do you think I did? I found Jude, and we went after her." "To Northcote Gorge?" Jenny nodded. "Jude? He didn't think she'd really do it, even though she was standing at the edge of the cliff when we got there. The wind was whipping at her skirts and blowing her hair across her face. I begged her to get back from the edge, and Jude, he told her not to be such a damned fool. She looked over at us, didn't say anything, just looked at us in a quiet, steady way that scared the hell out of me. There was a full moon that night, and I could see the determination in her eyes. Then she just stepped over the edge into nothing." Jenny fell silent again, her gaze fixed unblinkingly on the distance, and Sebastian knew she was seeing again the young woman's skirts billowing in the moonlight, hearing the bone-breaking thump and tumble of her body hitting the rocks as she plummeted into the gorge. "You didn't tell anyone?" Her features hardened. "Why would we? So they could bury her at the crossroads with a stake through her heart. That's the last thing we wanted. We told anyone and everyone who'd listened to us that she was laughing the last time we'd seen her, that she was happy, that there was no way she'd deliberately kill herself. But the coroner's jury didn't believe us." "When Lord Seaton died a few months later, did you never think someone might have killed him?" "I figured maybe Miles Grant, the blacksmith, got him." "Was Hannah also carrying Seaton's child?" "I don't know, but she was lying with him, that I do know." "How do you know that?" "Because she told—" Jenny broke off, her nostrils flaring on a sudden intake of breath. "She told whom? You? Or someone else?" "I don't remember," she said, staring boldly back at him, not caring that he knew she was lying. "Was Hannah Grant your cousin as well?" "No. Her people moved down here from Ludlow." She lifted her chin. "So you see, there's no connection between Sybil's death and what's happening in the village now." Sebastian wondered if she actually believed that, or if she was simply trying to convince him, the way she tried to convince the village that her cousin had fallen to her death. He said, "Did you know Darragh Flanagan is dead?" Her lips parted, the sinews of her throat tightening. "When?" "Sometime last night or early this morning." He expected her to say, "Why would anyone kill Darragh Flanagan?" He waited for her to say it, because it was the logical, inevitable response to such an announcement. But she didn't say it. Then he saw the stark bleakness in her eyes and knew with a sinking certainty that she didn't ask because her mind was quick.
She already knew why someone would kill Darragh Flanagan, just as she had a pretty good idea as to who had done it. It wasn't obvious or easily discernible, the twisted thin cord of anger and revenge that connected one untimely death to the next. But it was there, the passion and outrage of youth leading to a mature and ruthless instinct for self-preservation. And Sebastian wondered, had it begun on that long-ago Midsummer's Eve, when Jude Lowe watched the young niece he'd known and loved all his life step off a cliff into oblivion? Or had the origins of that murderous fury begun earlier, with the tarred, blackened body of a childhood friend hung up to rot in the cold embrace of a gibbet's iron cage? He wondered, too, if Hannah Grant really had drowned herself in that mill pond, or if the last thing she'd known was the angry, brutal grasp of a jealous young man, a man who'd once loved her, only to be rejected when she turned from him to a wealthy lord he knew to be both selfish and cruel. "I was more'n a bit sweet on Hannah myself when I was a lad," Jude had told him. "More'n a bit." The wind gusted up, shivering the leaves of the elms edging the stream, and bringing with it the scent of coming rain. It was all conjecture, of course. Sebastian knew only too well that just because an explanation fits neatly doesn't mean it's true. Never in his years of solving murders had he so desperately wished to be wrong. But he felt the rightness of it like a sick certitude deep in his gut. He was aware of Jamie Knox's twin staring at him, her fine, intelligent eyes flat and still, as if she could will from their depths any betraying glimmer of the truth. And he wanted to say to her, "You know, don't you? You might have not known it before, but you figured it all out now. You know the secret violent soul of the man who's always been more like a second brother to you than an uncle. You know he swore to kill Leopold Seaton all those years ago. You know where he gets the fine brandy that he hides in his cellars, and the inexplicable wealth he must be careful not to show anyone he doesn't trust. You know he was the one who supposedly urged Darragh Flanagan to stay when the Irishman so conveniently came riding through the town on the day of Alistair Coombs' funeral, and you've always suspected why, even if you've never admitted it to yourself. Just as you've always suspected that the flames that consumed Maplethorpe Hall had nothing to do with a candle and a wind-blown curtain, and everything to do with that tar-soaked gibbet and a government informant brought in specifically to end the subversive protests against George Irving's ruthless bill of enclosure." "Whatever happened to him?" Sebastian asked, and she shook her head, not understanding his question. "What Jones, I mean. The squatter you told me lied at Alex Dalrymple's trial." "He went away." Which he undoubtedly did, although Sebastian suspected he didn't get far. He stared across the stream at the stile Emma Chandler had climbed the afternoon of her death. But only once, not twice. And the irony of her fate struck him suddenly as both cruel and heart-rendingly senseless. She had come to Ayleswick to uncover the truth about her parents in the hopes of better understanding who and what she was. And all she had found was her own death. He said, "Is there another way to get to the Priory ruins, besides following the stream here?" "You can come at it from Northcote, and there's a footpath starts across from the village church and cuts through the wood." "Thank you," he said, touching his hand to his hat. "Did it never occur to you," she said, as he turned away, "that if you hadn't interfered, if you'd let that young woman's death be ruled a suicide, then Hannibal Pierce, Reuben Dickey, and Darragh Flanagan would all still be alive today?" He paused to look back at her. "Are you suggesting their deaths are my fault?" "Death follows you," she said, her hands coming up to grip her upper arms and hug them to her. "You brought it here." He forced himself to meet her gaze. "Ayleswick was no stranger to violent death long before I arrived, and you know it." He thought she might deny it. but she didn't. Chapter 58. He found Hero and Simon watching the ducks on the village green. She turned, the child in her arms, her brilliant smile of welcome fading when she saw his face. "Devlin, what is it?" He stood beside her and watched as their son prattled gibberish at the quacking, waddling ducks. He wanted to say, "I came to Shropshire because I can't seem to let go of this need to know the true identity of my father, to know if I lost a brother the day Jamie Knox died, to know why my eyes are yellow rather than a deep, sincere blue. Except, all I've found are more questions, and a murdered young woman on a painful quest so similar to my own. And now, in the process of solving her murder, I'm afraid I'm about to destroy what's left of a family that has already suffered too much because of me." But he didn't say any of those things. Instead, he squinted up at the dark clouds building over the distant hills and said, "Think we can make it out to the Priory before the storm hits?" They left Simon with his nurse, then took the path that led from the ancient parish church of St. Thomas through a dense wood of beech and elm. As they walked, he told her of his conversations with Lucien Bonaparte and Jenny Dalrymple, and of the long-ago tragic death of Sybil Moss, and everything he believed had followed it. She said, "You think Lucien Bonaparte was lying when he claimed only Flanagan was at the Priory that day?" "I think he believed he told the truth. But that doesn't mean Jude Lowe wasn't there, only that Bonaparte didn't know it." The wind was kicking up, thrashing the limbs of the trees overhead, and he saw her tilt back her head, her lips parting as she gazed up at the sky. Could Jude Lowe really be that evil? "I doubt he sees himself as evil. I'm sure he thinks he's had a good reason for everything he's done." "He's evil," said Hero. Sebastian shrugged. "As far as he's concerned, he's fighting a war against centuries of oppression and exploitation by the likes of everyone from George Irving and Leopold Seton to the English crown. He looked at what the revolutionaries were trying to accomplish across the Channel in France, and he wanted those kinds of reforms here. I don't know how long he's been cooperating with the French, but I doubt it was before the hangings of 1793. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it was that spate of judicial murders that initially pushed him toward the French." They'd reached the stream at the edge of the wood, and she paused for a moment, her gaze on the ruins of the old priory thrusting up pale and sombre against the roiling clouds in the west. "I can understand his killing Seton and Irving," she said, "even if I don't condone it. But there is no possible justification for the murder of Emma Chandler. She was completely innocent of anything." "Yes, but that's what happens when a man appoints himself as judge and executioner of his fellow beings. What begins as a moral, righteous impulse can all too quickly degenerate into what's convenient for him." They crossed a rugged bridge to the meadow, the flock of sheep scattering before them as thunder rumbled in the distance. Following a passage through the monastery's confused tumble of fallen stones and ruined walls, they came out in the central cloister. Hero had brought the satchel with Emma's sketchbook, and she opened it now to the final drawing. "Emma must have been standing about here when she drew this," she said, positioning herself in the cloister by comparing the ruins of the chapter house to Emma's sketch. Then she lowered the sketchbook, her face pinched as if with pain. "What?" he asked. "I don't understand why Flanagan and Lowe felt they needed to kill her. I mean, if they found her here sketching, why not simply go away and arrange for Flanagan to pass the message from Paris to Bonaparte another time? I suspect they didn't realize she was here until she'd already seen or overheard something that betrayed what they were about. That's why they killed her." "But surely they would have looked around when they first arrived to make certain they were alone?"
I've no doubt they did. Which tells us that by the time they arrived, Emma was no longer here in the cloisters.
Hero turned in a slow circle, her gaze scanning the broken walls and weed-choked walks around them. So where was she? He found himself staring at what was left of the refectory, the lacy sandstone tracery of its outer row of soaring, point-arched windows showing pale against the increasingly storm-darkened sky. Running nearly the entire length of the cloister's south walk, the monks' stately dining hall had been built above an undercroft, both to provide storage for foodstuffs and as a deliberate echo of the cenaculum, the upper room in Jerusalem where the Last Supper was said to have taken place. A grand portal that once marked the entrance to the refectory's main stairs had long ago collapsed, but a second, narrower set of steps, its barrel vault still intact, led down to the chamber below. Hero looked from Sebastian to the undercroft's entrance and whispered, "Oh, my lord." A growing wind buffeted their faces and flattened the lank grass as they crossed the cloister. The ancient stone steps were crumbling with age and littered with debris, and she was about to descend when he put out a hand, stopping her. "Look," he said. Two distinct sets of men's footprints showed in the dust of the centuries, one smaller, the other noticeably longer. The men had passed up and down the steps several times, nearly obliterating a third set of prints, left by a woman's half-boots. Dainty footprints that went down, but did not come back up. "She died down there, didn't she?" said Hero, her voice hushed.
"I'm afraid so."
They picked their way down the ancient stairs in silence, his stomach hollowing out with the implications of what they had found. He imagined Emma finishing her sketch of the chapter house, and then turning, sketchbook still in hand, to notice the steps to the undercroft. Intrigued, she must have ventured down the steep steps, surely as awed as they were, when the beauty of the ancient vast chamber opened up before her, its sturdy stone vaulting and central row of stout Norman piers perfectly preserved, its outside range of round-headed windows echoing the perpendicular windows of the refectory above. Had she been planning to make a sketch of the undercroft, he wondered? Was that why she lingered? Or did she hear Flanagan's and Lowe's voices and decide to remain out of sight, lest she discomfort them by her unexpected appearance? If so, it was a decision she surely came to regret. "I wonder how they knew she was here," said Hero.
"She may have accidentally made some sound. Or Lowe could have decided to search down here, and came upon her by chance."
"And so he killed her," said Hero, her words echoing eerily in the cavernous space. "He pinned her down against the rough flagstone floor and quietly smothered her."
"Yes."
A single lady's glove lay beside one of the undercroft's central octagonal piers, and Sebastian bent to pick it up. He had no way of knowing for certain, but he suspected Flanagan had been horrified when he discovered what Lowe had done. They would have had to leave Emma's body here in the undercroft until nightfall, using the remaining hours of daylight to trick Alice Gibbs into helping them obscure the time and place of Emma's death. Then, under cover of darkness, they would have returned to shift the body to the water meadows, carefully staging the scene to look like a suicide. But in the darkness, they had overlooked one dropped glove and the telltale footprints on the stairs. Nor had they seen Reuben Dickey watching them from the undergrowth at the edge of the river. "It all seems so pointless," said Hero. Thrusting Emma's sketchbook back into the satchel, she crossed the chamber to stand at one of the empty windows that looked out on the trickling stream and the wind-tossed wood beyond. After a moment, she said, "Do you ever think about the simple, seemingly inconsequential decisions people make in the course of going about their lives? Decisions that can inadvertently get them killed? If Emma had picked a different day to walk out here and sketch the ruins, Or if she simply hadn't noticed the stairs to this undercroft. She'd still be alive today.
As would the rest of them.
Thunder rumbled around them in a crashing crescendo of fury that rolled on, and he said,
"We need to get back."
A few scattered drops of rain pattered on the stones in the cloisters above, filling the air with the scent of wet dust as they turned toward the stairs. "What will you do next?" said Hero, as he followed her up the steps.
"That depends on whether Major Weston is alive or dead."
"And if he's She broke off, and he saw her stiffen as she emerged from the barrel-vaulted stairwell into the growing fury of the storm.
"What is it?"
he asked, or started to ask. Except by then he'd reached the top of the steps himself. In the gathering gloom, he could plainly see the tall, lean figure of Jude Lowe, and the long-barreled flintlock pistol Jude held, with the muzzle pressed against the side of Hero's head. Chapter 59.
"Don't move,"
said Jude. Sebastian froze, his gaze locking with Hero's. He could feel his pulse racing in his neck, feel the wind buffeting his suddenly sweat-slicked face.
"Let her go,"
he said, even though he knew it was useless.
"Your quarrel is with me, not my wife."
Jude tightened his grip on Hero's upper arm, keeping her between them as he dragged her back one stumbling step.
"Put your hands where I can see them and back away. Slowly. Do it,"
he snarled, when Sebastian hesitated. Overhead, the sky was a turmoil of roiling dark clouds rent by quick, bright flashes of lightning. Sebastian splayed his hands out at his sides and placed one foot behind the other, moving cautiously over the uneven, rubble-strewn ground. He knew that if he tried to rush Jude, Hero would be dead in an instant. But he knew, too, that while Jude might intend to kill Sebastian first, the innkeeper would never allow Hero to leave the priory alive.
"That's far enough,"
said Jude, thumbing back the hammer on his flintlock.
"I didn't want to have to kill you."
"Why? Because I look like Jamie?"
"That must be it."
Jude's nostrils flared on a suddenly indrawn breath. They could smell rain in the wind, hear the roar of the storm descending on them.
"You should have left well enough alone. Perhaps you shouldn't have killed an innocent young woman."
Jude shook his head.
"She gave me no choice. Like you."
Sebastian watched Jude's hand. His only hope was to throw himself sideways at the last instant when the innkeeper fired, and he felt his body tensing as he waited for Jude's finger to tighten on the pistol's trigger. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Hero shift her grip on Emma's satchel. When Lowe shifted the muzzle of his pistol toward Sebastian, Hero swung the satchel up to send it smashing into Jude's right hand. The pistol exploded into the air in a flash of flaming powder and went clattering across the fallen stones.
"You bloody bastard,"
swore Sebastian, and threw himself forward. Jude shoved Hero aside as Sebastian rammed into him, hands fisting in the cloth of Jude's coat, his momentum driving both men backward across the cloisters. Jude's heel hit a loose stone, and he lost his balance, grabbing Sebastian's forearms to pull Sebastian over with him as he fell. Sebastian came down hard on his knees, the two men breaking apart as Jude pivoted to take the impact on one shoulder and hip and kept rolling. Sebastian started to lurch up, but he'd made it only halfway when Jude jackknifed forward to wrap his arms around Sebastian's legs and pull him down again. Drawing back his arm, Sebastian slammed the heel of his hand into Jude's face as they fell. The innkeeper's nose smashed in a wet, hot smear of blood, the impact rocking Jude back, breaking his hold on Sebastian, and sending the innkeeper sprawling on his back in the rubble-strewn grass. Then Jude's fist closed over a chunk of stone, and he pushed up to swing it at Sebastian's head. It was raining harder now, big wet drops that splattered the dust around them. Sebastian jerked out of the way, the rock grazing his shoulder as he kicked out. He landed a glancing blow on Jude's thigh, but lost his balance and went down again just as Jude pulled a knife from an unseen sheath at the small of his back. Sebastian fumbled for the double-barreled flintlock he tucked into his pocket and felt the hammer catch on the edge of his pocket. Bloody hell. He jerked the pistol free just as Jude reared up, kicking the gun out of Sebastian's hand and slashing at him with the knife. Sebastian lunged sideways, but felt Jude's blade rip through the cloth of his coat to slice a line of fire through the flesh beneath. He turned the lunge into a roll, reaching down to yank his own knife from his boot as he came up again in a crouch. Then he leapt back, just in time as Jude slashed again, this time toward his face. The rain came down in a torrent, drumming on the old weathered stones of the priory around them and flattening the grass in the cloisters. Sebastian was dimly aware of heroes circling around them. She'd retrieved his double-barreled flintlock from where it had fallen, and now held it in a strong two-handed grip. But the two men were too close together for her to risk a shot. Then Jude plunged his knife towards Sebastian's chest. "No!" she shouted. For one critical moment, she caught Jude's attention, and his focus wavered. Sebastian slammed his left fist into Jude's wrist, knocking the blade aside as he stepped in to drive his own knife hard, like a sword, deep into the innkeeper's heart. Their rain-washed faces now just inches apart, Sebastian's gaze met that of the man he'd just killed. He saw the shock in Jude's dark brown eyes, saw his knowledge of imminent death fade to bewilderment and something else. Something that looked very much like confusion and hurt. "Jamie?" Jude whispered, his eyes rolling back in his head as he collapsed. Sebastian caught his weight as he fell, eased the innkeeper's body down into the rubble-strewn grass. Then he straightened, his breath coming hard and fast enough to jerk his chest. Hero came to stand beside him, his flintlock pistol still held loosely in one hand. "Is he dead?" she asked, her gaze on the blood-smeared face of the man at their feet. "Yes." "Good." Sebastian didn't say anything, because there really was nothing to say. And she wrapped her arms around his neck and held him close, while the rain poured around them and his breathing eased. Chapter 60. Thursday, 12th of August. The inquest into the death of Jude Lowe was held less than 24 hours later, immediately after those that had already been scheduled. The verdict was justifiable homicide. Afterward, Sebastian and Archie Rawlins walked out to the crossroads where the blacksmith and two of his sons were working with pickaxes and shovels to dig up what was left of Hannah Grant. No one had given them official permission, but Sebastian suspected no one was going to stop them either, just as he had no doubt the vicar would allow Hannah to be reburied in the churchyard. There was much that was disgusting about Benedict Underwood, but there was some good there, too. Sebastian watched in silence as Miles Grant, his face wet with silent tears, tenderly placed his daughter's skull in a wide-topped basket. Then Sebastian's gaze shifted to the ship, deserted now in the late afternoon sunlight. He'd learned only that morning that Lowe was a widower, that his wife had died of a fever less than a year ago, and he found himself thinking of Lowe's 3 boys, and what would happen to them now. Archie said, "I'm still having a hard time getting used to the idea that Jude Lowe has been killing people around here for 15 years and more. From the sound of things, he stopped for quite a few years in there. I wonder why. Perhaps there was no one he wanted dead." Archie pushed out a strangled huff of air. "I suppose that's something to be grateful for." He was silent for a moment, then said, "There have been so many deaths these last 10 days. It's not going to be easy for the people of the village to absorb it all. They've lost too many over the years." "At least it's finally over." Archie nodded. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done.
I never would have figured this out if you hadn't been here."
"You don't know that?"
"Yes, I do. If it had been up to me, I'd have hanged the vicar." "The vicar?"
"Jude Lowe was a very clever man."
"He certainly fooled me. I hope to God I never have to face anything like this again."
"You'll do all right. Just keep an open mind, and remember that simply because an explanation seems to fit doesn't mean it's true."
They turned back toward the village, the towering old gibbet casting its long shadow across a section of the coach road left muddy by the previous day's rains. After a moment, Archie said,
"So, how do you know when you finally have it right?"
"I'm not sure."
"You just do,"
said Sebastian, and Archie threw back his head and laughed. Later that evening, as the sun slipped toward the purple hills of Wales, Sebastian climbed the lane to the churchyard. He stood beside Emma Chandler's graveside for a long time, while the rooks flew in to roost in the nearby yew, fluttering and cawing as they settled in for the night. He felt an intense, painful bond with this woman he had come to know only after her death. They had both come to Ayleswick on team in the hopes of discovering the identity of the man who had sired them. Both had failed, but only Emma had lost her life in the quest. So adrift was he in his own thoughts that it was a moment before Sebastian heard a woman's faint footfalls and the swish of fine cloth, and realized he was no longer alone.
"Am I interrupting you?" asked Lady Seaton, walking up to him.
She wore a simple muslin dress with a light blue spencer and a wide-brimmed straw hat that framed her golden curls in a way that made her look deceptively young and vulnerable.
"No, not at all," he said.
She tipped back her head to look up at him, the warm evening breeze fluttering the blue satin ribbon of her hat across her cheek.
"I wanted to ask you something."
"Of course."
"I believe I told you I once met Lady Emily."
"Yes."
She drew a deep breath and nodded, as if confirming the truth of her earlier statement, or perhaps simply encouraging herself to go on.
"What I didn't tell you was that we met on the last night of the Irvings' house party. They held a grand ball, a masquerade, and although I wasn't well, Seaton insisted I attend. He felt the need to trot out his wife on occasion, you see, to reassure the local gentry that despite the irregular nature of his activities, he still retained my love and devotion."
Sebastian said nothing, and after a moment she went on,
"Leopold was an extraordinarily attractive man, with a most deceptively charming manner. He had a way of paying attention to a woman, of smiling at her, that could make her feel the most beautiful, most fascinating and desirable woman in the world."
"And he'd turned his charms on Lady Emily?"
"He did, yes. I watched them. You might think it was because I was jealous, but it wasn't. Not by then. I knew what he was like, and I worried about her."
Sebastian remembered the words the 16-year-old girl had written to her governess.
"He is so handsome that my head would surely be turned, were it not for Liv's warnings." I could tell she was flattered. How could she help but be? She was so young and innocent. But she was wise enough not to forget that he was a married man, and while she seemed happy enough to have the opportunity to practice the arts of flirtation with a master, I could see that she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the tenor of his attentions. In the end, she excused herself and went outside for some air. She was trying to get away from him, of course, but I'm afraid he took it the wrong way."
"He followed her?"
She nodded. "I should have gone after them immediately. Instead, I waited, hoping she'd come back. And then Lady Irving buttonholed me as I was headed toward the terrace. She was so persistent, I'd only just managed to extricate myself when I saw Leopold slipping back in through the glass doors. He was vaguely dishevelled, and when Lady Emily didn't come back at all, I went looking for her, fearing the worst."
"And you were right."
"Yes,
I found her in the shrubbery, hysterical. I knew he'd forced himself on some of the village girls, but I never imagined he'd so forget himself as to do the same to a young gentlewoman. I helped her to her room, made her promise to let me come to her aid in the event she should find herself in trouble as a result of that night's work. Lady Seaton's gaze dropped to the grave beside them. Obviously, it was a promise she didn't keep. But my God, how I wish she had. You can have no notion of my joy the day his lordship's lifeless body was carried home. She looked up at him. But you knew that, didn't you? Did you imagine I'd killed him?
Yes.
A strange smile played about her lips. I used to lie awake at night and entertain myself concocting various ways in which I might murder him and get away with it. But I never would have found the courage to do it. Fortunately, someone else did it for me.
Did you know, even then?
That someone had killed him? Oh, yes. But I didn't know who. She drew a deep, shaky breath. I haven't told Crispin the truth. That Emma Chandler was his half-sister, I mean.
Will you?
I don't know. Sometimes I think it might make it easier for him to know they could never have married, even if she had lived. But then I think, the woman he loved is already lost to him. What good would it serve for him to have to live with the horror of knowing he desired his own sister? Perhaps it would be best after all to leave him with the memory of his lost love intact.
How well does Lord Seaton remember his father?
Hardly at all. He was very young when his father died, and Leopold never had any interest in what he used to call snotty-nosed nursery brats.
Does he know what his father was like?
You mean, does he know Leopold had a nasty habit of slaking his lust on the village girls, willing or not? I don't believe so, no. But I must admit, I hadn't thought of what it would do to Crispin to learn such an ugly truth about his father.
He may eventually hear some of it anyway, from someone in the village.
Yes. She searched his face, and he wondered if she saw there the traces of his own long-ago secret anguish that their conversation had dredged up. So what are you saying? That I should tell him?
You're the one who must bear the burden of keeping this a secret for the rest of your life.
I would do that for Crispin, gladly, if only I could be certain it was right.
There's no denying secrets can be dangerous. Yet some secrets. I believe some secrets are best left unknown. It would be different had she lived.
Yes, it would. She gave him a faint, tremulous smile. Thank you, my lord. He watched her walk away, her head held high, her back rigorously straight, her features carefully schooled into an expression that betrayed not a hint of the turmoil in her heart, or the admirable strength of her will. Friday, 13th of August. The next morning, Sebastian had two obligations to fulfill before he left the village. First, he climbed the lane to the vicarage, where Benedict Underwood was supervising two workmen repairing a gap in the orchard wall. Taking the vicar aside, he warned Underwood that if he ever laid a hand on his cousin Rachel Timms again, Sebastian would not only make certain he lost the living of Ayleswick, but see to it that he was never given another parish. The Reverend's practised benevolent smile remained firmly in place. Sebastian said, "And if you think Rachel Timms is too afraid of losing Hill Cottage to be honest with me, then you should know that I've promised her a cottage on my own estate down in Hampshire, should that come to pass." Underwood's smile slid away. Sebastian touched a hand to his hat.
"Good day to you, Reverend."
After that, he walked out to the little whitewashed cottage beside the stream. He found Hetty Kincaid dozing on a bench in the warm sunshine, and there, hat in hand, he expressed his sorrow for the death of her son. She lifted her blind face to him, showing him the ravages left by another unbearable loss.
"I don't blame you for it,"
she said, her voice breaking.
"Maybe if Jude had had a better da, things would have turned out different. But,"
she paused to draw a painful breath,
"I was always afraid he'd end up being hanged. So in a sense I suppose you could say I'm grateful to you for sparing us that."
She asked him then to sit beside her, and he spoke to her of Jamie Knox and of the child the ex-rifleman had had by the barmaid Pippa, and how much the boy resembled his dead father. As he talked, he was aware of Jenny watching him through the window of the cottage. It wasn't until he rose to take his leave that she came to stand in the open doorway, her arms crossed at her chest. Her face was hard, her eyes red and swollen from her own grieving.
"I didn't send him after you,"
she said.
"Jude, I mean. I wanted you to know that."
Sebastian paused beside her.
"But you did speak to him after I left."
It was more a statement than a question. She stared across the stream to where Jude's 3 orphaned sons were playing with a puppy.
"I was hoping Jude'd tell me I was wrong about him. But he didn't.
And in the end, all I did was warn him that you'd figured it out. For that, I am sorry."
Sebastian nodded, although he wasn't sure if she was sorry because she'd put his life and Hero's in danger, or because Jude had ended up dead. She said, "His father, Daniel Lowe, was without a doubt the meanest man I've ever known, and even worse when he had the drink in him, which was often. I'm not sure who he beat more, Jude or Jamie, but after Jamie left, Jude was the only one he had to use his fists on."
"Daniel Lowe died in 97.
Jenny nodded.
"Fell off a haystack onto a pitchfork. I always figured Jude did for him, although Jude never admitted it. I think maybe he was the first person Jude killed."
Sebastian wasn't so certain of that, but all he said was,
"I'm surprised he didn't kill Eugene Weston long ago."
"I wanted to, but he and the Major were in the free trade business together. Weston always liked to claim he didn't take to smuggling until after old man Irving died, but it wasn't true. He and Jude had teamed up long before that, a good 6 months before Alex was hanged. Jude had the brains and the guts to organize and oversee everything, but Weston was the one with the money. Jude needed him."
"I guess Jude decided he didn't need him any more,"
said Sebastian. Weston and the caretaker, Silas Madden, had been found in one of the bays of the carriage house, their deaths staged to look like a murder-suicide. Jude had set it up so well that if he hadn't decided to go after Sebastian, he might well have succeeded in blaming the long string of both recent and past killings on the Major. Jenny shifted her gaze to where her grandmother now sat quietly mourning another dead child. Sebastian saw a quiver of emotion pass over her features. "I know you won't believe it, but there was much that was good in Jude. He was so loving and funny and kind."
"As long as you stayed on the right side of him,"
thought Sebastian. And he wondered if they'd ever know how many people the innkeeper had murdered over the years. He turned to leave, but she stopped him by saying,
"You asked about Jamie's and my father."
He paused to look back at her. She said, "Before my mother died, she told Nana that she'd lain with 3 men, an English lord, a Welsh cavalryman, and a stable hand named Ian, from out at Maplethorpe Hall. But Ian was killed when Jamie and me was only 2 years old." She tipped her head to one side, regarding him appraisingly. "I'm 36 now. How old are you?"
"I'll be 31 this October."
"So I guess that narrows it down a bit, doesn't it?"
she said, her gaze meeting his, as a tentative smile curled her lips. The End. This is Davina Porter. We hope you have enjoyed this production of When Falcons Fall by C.S. Harris. Recorded Books offers a wide selection of bestsellers, classics, histories, and more. So look for us at your public library or on download sites online. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.